I was very fortunate growing up that I knew all of my grandparents. They all lived in this area. I never did find out about my mother's parents, but my grandfather, my father's father, was born on a farm outside of Vineland. When my grandfather was 15 years old, he left the farm and came to Atlantic City to live with his older brother, who had a business at that time on the boardwalk. My grandfather was a graduate of the Atlantic City High School on the site that we're sitting in today. Then went to law school. You didn't bother to go to college in those days. You went right from high school to law school. Came back to Atlantic City and opened up a law practice in 1907. And one how or another, the Perskies have been in the law business in the Atlantic City area ever since. He married my grandmother, who was from New York. Never did find out exactly how that connection got made either, but my grandmother came down here and they started a family, and here we are. My parents were neighbors. My mother's parents lived a block and a half or 2 blocks away from my father's parents. They were not, they were 3 years, I guess, difference in age, but they had no relationship. They knew each other when they were in high school. Eventually, my father went to the University of Pennsylvania and then to the law school at Penn. My mother started out at Syracuse, transferred to Penn after her first year, and when they were both at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s, that's when they started a relationship, and they married in 1939. She got married. She had babies. She was also very active in community events, social and charitable organizations, but in those days it was not the norm for a woman to have employment, and she never did. They had, why is that awkward? Their first child didn't survive birth. Then they had a second child, another boy, was my older brother, and I'm the third. No, I recall nothing about World War II. What I do recall was that at the age of, well, let me see, I was 4 or 5 years old when my parents had built a new house in Margate and rented in the summers to live with my grandparents in Atlantic City. So I got to be very close at that time, among others, with my Uncle Marvin, who had been a veteran of World War II and who in 1950 and 51 volunteered to go to Korea, and spent a year and a half in Korea. So I came to understand the concept of war through him and his Marine Corps stories and the fact that he was in Korea. The first job that I had actually was at Castle's supermarket in Margate. I was a bag boy, and I started at the age of 12. Did that for a couple of summers until I got old enough to become a lifeguard at a pool in one of the motels in Atlantic City. And then the job I have never forgotten all these years later. I was 21 years old. My father had a client who owned a bar in Atlantic City, and the client was talking to my father, complaining about the fact that last summer he had hired some guys to go behind the bar and they had robbed him blind, and he was trying to find somebody that he could trust. I wound up spending the summer running, at the age of 21, running a bar on South Carolina Avenue in Atlantic City, hired all my friends, and had the time of my life. Did that 2 summers because after the second summer I had to get involved. My Uncle Marvin was running for the state senate, and I had to make myself available that summer to help in his campaign. Sitting in this room, coming into this building and sitting in this room is a surreal experience. I spent 4 years on this site in what would have been the room in which we are now sitting as a student at the Atlantic City High School, as did my parents, as did my children, as did a number of the other members of my family. When I look out the window and I see exactly the same things that I saw looking out the windows of the high school then, when I walk the stairs and walk the halls today, looking at the rooms and thinking to myself, okay, that was where I had the French class, and this is where I had the history class, It's a surreal experience. Outside of immediate family issues, most of my recollections were growing into, in retrospect, were growing into what would become the political component of my identity. I remember being incredibly excited in 1960 for reasons I didn't even fully understand at the time about the presidential election that year. And of course my uncle's involvement in politics, my father's attempt to be appointed to the bench and how that interacted with the political process. A meeting that we had in 1961 in our house, that was the year somebody named Richard Hughes had stepped down from a judgeship in the state and had accepted a nomination to be governor. He was a friend of my father's, and sometime during that summer there was a coffee klatch at our house that my father had sponsored for him, and either after or before, I don't remember, we were sitting around chatting. I was 16 years old and not as respectful of authority or importance as somebody should be who's only 16. And I remember a conversation that I had with Dick Hughes that I've never forgotten, because I can't imagine how impolite I was. That was, if you'll recall, that was 1961. I had a conversation with candidate Hughes. That was the year that the Berlin Wall was built, and there was an international crisis with respect to that. And the the candidate was at our house for a coffee klatch, and we were sitting around, and being as wise a guy as I was, I said something to him to the effect, Judge, if you're elected, what are you going to do about Berlin? Which was kind of a snide question. And I, of course, had no idea that there was a municipality in New Jersey, in Camden County, known as Berlin. And he answered me by talking about how he was going to improve the access from the White Horse Pike. And everybody kind of looked at me and said, see, wise guy, you got yours. And that was 1961. You can do the arithmetic for how many years ago that was. I've never forgotten it. Mickey Mantle was my first hero. My relationship, if you will, with Mickey Mantle colored all of my later preferences. First of all, I'm an ardent baseball fan, the game itself. And second, I am an ardent Yankee fan as well. I got both of those from my father, and I've passed them on to my children, who are as ardent as I am. The mantelpiece came about because when I was 5 years old, in 1950, my hero was the center fielder for the Yankees, a fellow by the name of Joe DiMaggio, who my father would tell me about, and every game he would tell me what he had done and show pictures. You didn't have any televisions in those days. But I knew a lot about Joe DiMaggio, and he was my hero. And then at the age of 5, at the top of his game, he had the nerve to retire, which crushed me. Of course, it did also, as I look back on it many years later, leave me with a lesson that going out on top is not such a terribly bad thing to do. In any event, when DiMaggio retired, and I was very upset about it, my father told me that the Yankees had found a new young kid that was going to take over in center field, and that I should pay attention to him because my father thought he would be pretty good. And that's where Mickey Mantle came in. When I started to study and get involved in studying history, which has always been my main focus, still is, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt got to the front very fast and have stayed there. Some of the others that I learned about at that time, I was attracted to, and then as I've read over the years more about them, or watched plays about them in New York, my opinions have changed. Villains, of course, growing up as I did when I did, Adolf Hitler was and remains the #1 villain of all time. From a political point of view, the only real villain that I can remember at this point was Richard Nixon, from a political perspective, not from a personal perspective. But you know, when you're young, 16, 18, 20 years old, very few things are gray. Most things are black or white. When I went to the high school on this site, there were some teachers then whose names and whose identities I recall 50, 60 some years later. There was a biology teacher by the name of Paul Schutte, who was spectacular. There was a Latin teacher by the name of Ogilvy. There were English teachers, Miss Innes and Mrs. Carter. There were others as well, and at that age, you form a great relationship with teachers that you can relate to or that related to you. And I had a wonderful relationship with almost all of the teachers at the high school. Getting to college, much less so. At Yale, I had obviously the opportunity to interact with some heavyweights, but not on a personal basis, purely on an intellectual or academic basis. First and foremost, to be success as a lawyer. I had the advantage, coming back from law school, to walk in the door at what had been my father's law firm, which was now occupied by my uncle and by his partner, Bob Neustatter, who was a family friend of very long standing. They hired me, agreed to pay me a salary that I wasn't beginning to earn, also agreed to pay the tuition to send me to an extra year of law school at NYU to learn tax law. And my approach at that point was to develop as much experience as possible, as quickly as possible, in the practice of law. And for that reason, after I finished my tax degree, I accepted an offer from the local public defender's office to go in there on a part-time basis and try cases in the public defender's office while staying in the law firm on a regular basis. In 1880 or 81, a new czar took over in Russia for his father, Tsar Alexander, and he began, among other things, a set of pogroms. Pogroms were torturous raids on the Jewish communities in the area that Russia controlled, which at that time was not only Russia, but also what is now Poland and Belarus and the Ukraine and whatnot. There was a small village in Belarus, or Belarusia, called Volozhin. And the Jewish community in Volozhin was terrified of the Tsar. There was in Paris an organization that was founded by some of the leading Jewish citizens of France, called in French the Universal Jewish Alliance, Alliance Universelle Juive. And they got together and raised money to move, to export, if you will, Jewish residents of the Tsar's area. They sent them to what was then Palestine. They sent them to South America. They sent some to the United States, all on the basis of founding agricultural colonies where these people could live in peace. My great-grandparents were in Volozhin. They had 5 children at the time. They came through the Alliance program to a place outside of Vineland that was named in honor of the organization. It was named Alliance. It's still called that today. And they formed a colony in 1882 of 42 families from the area of Belarus. One of those was the Perskie family. After they got here in 1882, my grandfather was born, the last of the family, was born there in 1885. The colony existed as an agricultural colony for about 40 years or so, and then it dissipated. But yes, I have been there. The original synagogue that they built for the community is still there. There's a plaque on the wall that honors the 42 originating families, and my grandparents, great-grandparents' names, among others, are on that plaque. I never, or at least I don't remember, ever having met Mrs. Farley. Of course, I knew who she was, and I'm sure I saw her from time to time. But my memories of Hap Farley are extensive, even if somewhat superficial. He was the personification to me of everything that was wrong with the local political process. He was a boss. They were using a small d. His organization was very anti-democratic. He also had the collusion of the leaders of the Democratic Party, and they all got together to, from my perspective, to suppress the legitimate political process that you would want to have where two sides are fighting it out together. I met him a couple of times before the first election in 1971, never had any direct dealings with him. My father, of course, had extensive dealings with him because Senator Farley was intimately involved in the processes several times of the possible nomination of my father to be a judge. The first time he blocked it. The second time he made a deal with the governor and let it go through. At a conscious level, very little. At a subconscious level, it was everything. What role did Farley's history play in how I became what I became? I have to start with a story that is probably this, if not certainly one of the very few singular moments of my life. I was 21 years old. I was a first-year law student at the University of Pennsylvania. It was 1966. My father was a good friend of the governor's, as I've mentioned. Governor wanted to appoint my father as a judge. Senator Farley didn't want it to happen for political reasons. That was the same year, 1966, that my Uncle Marvin was serving in the New Jersey General Assembly, having been elected in '65, and was looking forward the next year in '67 to running for the state Senate against Farley, because at that time the Senate district consisted of Atlantic and Cape May together, or parts of it. My father wanted to be a judge. My uncle wanted to be a senator. My father and my uncle were very, very close, two of the three brothers. Third brother was close also. It was September of 1966. It was time for the Jewish holidays. We were going to have dinner at my grandmother's apartment, as we always did. Marvin was coming up from Cape May, and he let my father know that he had gotten a message from Farley, that Farley wanted to talk to him. And Marvin was coming to Atlantic City for Rosh Hashanah dinner in any event, so on the way to the dinner, he stopped at Farley's house and they had a conversation. And then Marvin came to my grandmother's apartment, and before the dinner, four of us went into the bedroom to hear what was going on. My Uncle Marvin, my father, my Uncle Lawrence, and myself. And Marvin said that Farley had told him, "I will approve your brother's appointment as a judge on the condition that you agree not to run against me next year for the Senate." And Marvin said to my father, "What should I tell him?" Again, as I've mentioned, my father's lifelong ambition was to be a judge. His father, my grandfather, had been a judge. My father wanted to be a judge. Marvin's entire adult life had been invested in the political process, and in particular in trying to destroy the organization that existed in Atlantic City. I'm 21 years old, I'm looking at this, and I'm now a lot older than 21, but it's as if it had happened yesterday. My father looked at Marvin without a second's hesitation and said, "Tell him to stick it up his ass. As far as I'm concerned, he'll do what he has to do and we'll do what we have to do." And Marvin said to him, "Are you sure?" And my father said, "Tell him to stick it up his ass." And Marvin went and told Farley exactly that, and then the next year it all got changed. The legislative district was changed. Marvin was going to run not for the Senate but for the Assembly. Farley made a different deal with the governor with respect to nominating my father and somebody else as judges. But in terms of a moment that shapes your life, that's the number one moment of my entire, certainly in a political context, of my entire life. These two men, not just biological brothers, but brothers in every sense of the word, couldn't have wanted more for each other than they did. And at that moment, artificially, there was a wall that they had to climb that had been put there by somebody else. And to see my father respond to that as he did was a life-changing moment. He didn't live long enough to be eligible for reappointment. What had happened was that in 1966, Governor Hughes had nominated him to be a judge, and Farley had blocked it. using senatorial courtesy. Then, in the process I've just explained, by 1967, circumstances had changed. Farley and the governor, Governor Hughes, made a deal. My father could get one seat, and a friend of Farley's could get the other. So my father was appointed in December of 1967 actually in those days it was a county court judgeship, but the function was the same as today, the Superior Court. And he served for 2 years, and then he died. In the meantime, however, those 2 years were among the happiest of his life. His father, my grandfather, had been a Supreme Court justice. It had been my father's ambition all of his life, eventually, to go on the bench. My father never had any direct interest in the political process. He had been offered, as a young man, in the late 30s, when he was, by the way, a registered Republican, he had been offered an opportunity to run as a Republican candidate for the legislature with Farley, and declined it, not for any political reasons, but because it wasn't my father's thing to be a political candidate. He played around the edges. He would support this person for that job or whatever, but he never wanted to get involved himself, as Marvin did. No, the first time I ran, unless you count the president of my high school class, the first time I sought political office was 1971, when I was recruited to run as a candidate for the General Assembly, and we won. Well, my relationship with Farley was kind of interesting as you look back on it. We first got directly involved with each other in 1971, which was the last year he ran and the first year I ran. So we were on opposite tickets. We really didn't know each other other than indirectly. He knew who I was, I knew who he was, but we had never had any dealings with each other. We would see each other during the course of the campaign, but it was always distant. It was polite, but nothing close. I remember one moment at a debate. I wasn't directly debating him. He was debating Joe McGahn, and I was debating the assembly candidates. But at one point he got somewhat rattled, and he referred to me as Assemblyman Perskie, which of course I was not at that point, but he was talking about Marvin, who had been, and I remember that all these years later. After the election, he lost, I won. I had the opportunity on a couple of occasions, most specifically having to do with the gambling referendum. I had the opportunity to go to see him, to ask him for his input or his help. And our relationship was professional, polite, and he agreed to do what I asked him to do. And I respected that. I did not. He had, of course, he had dinner at I had a lot of dinners at Orsatti's. He had a lot of dinners at Orsatti's. We never had dinner together. But when I used to go to Orsatti's, I would occasionally look around to see if he was there. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. Senator Farley did push for legalized gaming when he was a senator, and that's another very interesting story. It has to do with what became my relationship with Brendan Byrne. The first time that there was any significant or visible interest in bringing gaming to Atlantic City was in the late 60s, 67, 68. Farley was very much in favor of it, but at that point, Farley could not, for a variety of reasons, could not be identified as the principal sponsor of it. And there were several reasons for that, one of which was that at that time, the Assistant United States Attorney for New Jersey, whose father was Justice William Brennan of the United States Supreme Court. His son, William Brennan Jr., was the United States Attorney for New Jersey, and in the course of some investigation, had come out with a public statement, which was all over the state, identifying by name 4 members of the New Jersey legislature, including Farley, who were, in his words, and I quote, entirely too comfortable with organized crime. So in that context, for Farley to have sponsored a gaming resolution would have been political suicide. So he got a friend of his, a nice guy from Union County, Senator McDermott, sponsored the bill in Frank McDermott sponsored the bill in 1968, and it got nowhere. And then in the 1969 gubernatorial election, William Cahill was the Republican candidate who got elected governor, and he made no secret during the campaign and thereafter that he was completely opposed to the concept. So from 69 to 71, there was nothing for Farley to do about it. The governor of his own party was against it. He couldn't sponsor it. It was dead. The initial suggestion to bring casinos to Atlantic City came from some of the business people in Atlantic City who were starting to really hurt. The one that got the most attention at that time was a hotelier at the Shelburne by the name of Gary Malamut, and he persuaded a number of the other hotel owners and some of the other business people that this might be a good idea for Atlantic City. Most of the time people laughed at him. I remember when my father died in 1969, I was 24 years old, and we were at home after the funeral, and people come to visit to offer condolences, and Gary Malamut came to the house. And I remember having a conversation with him in my father's living room in 1969 about this subject and about his interest and why he thought it would be good for Atlantic City and why he thought it could happen. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, as a 24-year-old law student with no political gravitas at all, this guy's nuts. This is never going to happen. Who the heck does he think he is? That was in September of 1969. 26 months later, I was an assemblyman-elect in New Jersey and getting ready to sponsor that bill in the legislature. So the world changes very fast. Gary was very helpful in both the 74 and 76 referenda. Well, in terms of my career, it was the focal point of everything. Atlantic City's status was the focal point of everything that became important to me. When I was first elected to the Assembly in 1971, it was very obvious to everybody in and out of the state that Atlantic City was in dire, desperate straits. And nobody had a better idea than bringing casinos to Atlantic City, so I took a shot at that. It didn't work while Cahill was governor. It wasn't ever going to work while Cahill was governor. But for the reasons we can talk about, it became a viable opportunity later. Whether it worked or it didn't, it was the focal point of everything that I had to be as a legislator from Atlantic County. There were other issues and other interests, the farming community and the business community, the residential development on the mainland. All of these things were very important. But for anyone in the legislature who came from Atlantic County, the first question anybody wanted to ask you was, what are we going to do about Atlantic City? So my entire political career in the legislature, well, I had a lot to do with taxes, and I had a lot to do with the environment, and I had a lot to do with gun laws and a number of other things that interested me. My entire legislative career was essentially described and defined by what could I do about and what could I do for what was going on in Atlantic City. No one who ever represented Atlantic County in the legislature or in Congress or anywhere else ever came to that position with more sand in his shoes than I did. There were others with as much. But one of my early jobs, when was it? It was the first year of college, so that was 1963. I got a job, again, a client of my father's had a restaurant on the boardwalk, right opposite the Steel Pier. And I was in the window with a great big starched white chef's hat and an apron, and I was in the window being a short order cook. 63, 64, 65. Later on, I got a job as a lifeguard at a motel. Then I had a job one summer selling beach chairs on the beach. Everything that I did in high school and later socially had to do with Atlantic City. If we wanted to go to the movies, we went to Atlantic City. If we wanted to go bowling, we went out, took a bus uptown to Atlantic City. My family had been involved in Atlantic City. My grandmother had been the president of the school board. My grandfather had been city solicitor for Atlantic City. The family's business, the law practice, had always been centered in Atlantic City. Everything about what I was, everything about what I heard, everything about what I did was as a child, even though we didn't physically live in the city, we lived in Margate, but everything related to my identification with Atlantic City. I don't know how many dozens of times, with how many different dates, I went to see the diving horse. And when I got to college, and at some point or another in whatever the conversation, and I told the people I was in college with who were from all over the country that there was a horse that would dive off, somebody would stick a poker in his butt and he would dive into a tank. They would think I was making it up. Nobody would believe it. And in those days, I didn't have a video I could show them. In the early 70s, I want to say about 72, something like that, 73, there was a movie, which I didn't see for many years later. It starred Robert Redford, and it was called The Candidate. And it was a story about a fellow in California who gets recruited to run a hopeless race for the United States Senate in California. And then he gets elected. And on the night of the election, he turns around. It was a great surprise that he got elected. And on the night of the election, he turns around to his family or his campaign people or whatnot, and he says, okay, what do I do now? Why do I tell you that? Because when I ran in 1971, for the first time as a candidate for the Assembly, I didn't have the slightest focus on substantive agenda. My entire focus, 100%, was political. I wanted to be involved with and to further the goal of making dramatic political change in the environment in this community. It was a one-party system. We first spent several years taking control of the Democratic Party, which we eventually succeeded in doing, and then it became a matter of trying to be competitive in elections, which we also succeeded in doing. But I never, that was why I ran, that was what I was talking about. My whole campaign in 1971 was about the need for an honest two-party system where people could function in the right way. And I literally remember the next day after that election thinking to myself, okay, I took the day off after the election and I was home just kind of readjusting, and I said to myself, okay, tomorrow I can go back to work in the law office. Oh, wait a minute. Tomorrow I have to go to Trenton because they're going to give me a briefing session on how I function as an assemblyman. And literally the day after the election was the first time that I ever thought about a life as a legislator. Oh my goodness. I've got responsibilities. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to cast a vote. I don't know where I'm going to sit. I don't know anything. I don't know anybody up there. That's how I started. Pat McGahn, in 1971, was the campaign manager for the entire slate. His brother was the Senate candidate. I had known Pat for several years before that. He was a friend of my Uncle Marvin's. He had been at one point in my father's law office. We shared some political preferences, although I later learned that mine were substantive and his were tactical. But I had a decent relationship with him at that time. He was incredibly important in the first election in '71. Without his ability to structure and manage that campaign, it wouldn't have been as it was, and he did a terrific job with it. After the '71 election, my relationship with Pat began to shift. I remember, for example, in my first term, so 1972, there were some difficult votes coming up. I don't remember what they were. But the executive director of the General Assembly, who was a friend of mine, a guy that I liked and did well with, was trying to persuade me to vote yes where I wanted to vote no, or no where I wanted to vote yes, I don't remember. And he said to me, should I call Pat? And I said, not if you want to influence me. And Pat found out about that, directly or indirectly, whatever. And it was my perspective that Pat's interest at that point was being perceived by others as the go-to guy for Atlantic City. Anything you want in Atlantic City, anything you want from the legislators from Atlantic County, you got to come to me. Well, that was never going to work for me. And I made that clear politely but firmly, and Pat didn't like that. Then in '73, my second year, I decided, mostly about protecting myself, that I needed to become county chairman, county Democratic chairman, which I did. Pat was very unhappy about that. And he made it very clear to me, and I understood it, that even though I was county chairman now, he was going to run the '73 campaign for Joe's reelection, not me. And that was fine too. I didn't mind that. I had a different agenda for becoming county chairman. But my role as county chairman then put me in a specialized, fabulous, life-changing political relationship with the governor of the state of New Jersey. Governor and I became good friends. The governor and I became political colleagues. The governor and I became very close in every sense of the word. And Pat could not abide that. And as a result, that was Brendan Byrne. And as a result, by 1975, when I ran the third time, Pat made a significant effort, almost succeeded, in trying to prevent me from being reelected. I won anyway, but over his objection. And then 2 years after that was when I ran against him. By that time, it was gone. It was gone. All that was the nail in the coffin, and that was war. All the rest of it were skirmishes. '77 was war. I have regrets about how it evolved, but I have no regret for doing the kinds of things that I did. In the first campaign in 1971, Joe was running for the Senate, I was running for the Assembly, and we spent 20, 30 hours a week together, knocking on doors, going here, going there. He was exactly twice my age. I was 26, he was 52. It wasn't exactly a father-son relationship, but it was very close. And I trusted him, I believe he trusted me, and we certainly got along. And then in the first and second years when we were in the legislature, he did his thing in the Senate, I did mine in the Assembly, and again, we got along. I helped him do his bills, he helped me do mine. There were no problems. And in '73, we ran together again, this time with Chuck Worthington running with us for the Assembly. And that campaign was all right. Pat ran that campaign also, and nobody did anything to me adverse. It was fine. It wasn't as personal and as trusting as it had been before, but it was fine. But then as Pat's level of antagonism to me grew, it inevitably interfered with my relationship with Joe. And my relationship with Joe was always better than my relationship with Pat. But Joe and I then became, instead of becoming colleagues, we became people who shared some of the same agendas. And when it later got into the gambling referenda in '74 and '76, it got a little testy on occasion. Why did I run for the Senate in 1977 instead of running for re-election to the General Assembly? I would be a fabulously wealthy man if I could have charged any reasonable sum for the number of times that I have either been asked that question or asked it of myself. The problem with the question is that it doesn't have an immediate or an easy answer. But in simplified terms, when I ran in '75 for my third term, I did so for all the wrong reasons. I did so because externally people were begging me to run because they wanted to hold on to the seat for the Democrats. The governor was involved, the state chairman was involved, some of the local people. I really didn't want to run. I had exhausted myself in terms of agenda. I had tried for the gambling and failed. I had done the job I had done with the tax issue on which I was a leader. And I really didn't see any particular purpose to keeping going in it. I had given up the county chairmanship that I had held for 2 years. I really wanted to get out and go back to being a person. I had, at that point, 2-year-old sons who were going to need me as a father, and I was done. But I yielded to the temptation to run again for the third time in '75 for one reason more than any other. 75 was going to be a tough election. 71 and 73 were not. In retrospect, we won those two elections by a lot. 75 was going to be a problem year for a variety of reasons. The Republicans locally had good candidates running. It was going to be a Republican year, and there was a lot of concern about whether I could win. One of the main reasons in my mind to run again and to agree to the persuasions that I had been getting was that I did not want, I was in 1975, I was 30 years old. I did not want to spend the rest of my life persuading myself that, yeah, I could have won, but I didn't run because of all these reasons, and I didn't fail to run because I was afraid to lose. I decided I would rather run and lose than have to justify to myself for the rest of my life that I had run away from the fight. So I ran, I got elected. Okay, I'm now a third-term assemblyman. I got nothing much that's lighting my fire. But as a part of that campaign in 75, I had promised the people of Atlantic City and Atlantic County that if I got elected, I would take another shot at gambling. Remember, we had sponsored a referendum in 74. It got on the ballot. It got beat handily. But I had an idea for how to do it differently. Instead of being statewide, it would be just Atlantic City. Instead of being privately government-owned and operated, it would be privately owned and operated. Instead of being this or that, it had a whole bunch of different points of focus. And I had promised the people of Atlantic City that if I got reelected in 75, I would do that. So I got reelected, had the governor behind me. I put in a bill in January of 76 to go back on the ballot with a different question. And over the course of the year 1976, bang, 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 got it out of the Assembly, got it out of the Senate, formed the crack committee in Atlantic City, got to court, got judicial permission to be on the ballot, which was a difficult issue. Spent the summer traveling all over the state, campaigning for the referendum. Passed it in November of 1976, and now the world was different. Now, in 1976, after the November election, we've got a whole new world for Atlantic City. We've got a lot to do. I'm one of the people that's out front on it, and I can bring an awful lot to the table to make it happen. So the only question by now is, do I run for the Senate or do I run for the Assembly? And that question eventually got answered by a group of people that I was very close to. We had dinner the week after the election. There were 6 or 8 people in the room, most of them family. And we had to ask that question. Okay, you're going to run again. What do you run for? Do you run for the Senate? Do you run for the Assembly? And there was a lot of debate going back and forth. People were afraid of Pat. People knew that if I ran for the Senate, he would come after me, no holds barred. It was going to be very difficult. It was going to be very challenging. It was ugly. And then the same arguments were made. That's why you have to run. It was back and forth, back and forth. And again, I mentioned a few minutes ago, my Uncle Marvin and my father on the subject of what to do. Marvin was at that table and didn't say a word. And Marvin was at that point a close friend of Pat McGahn's. They had done a lot of legal work together. Marvin had brought Pat in to represent Resorts International because the people at Resorts were old friends of Marvin's. So after this debate goes back and forth for the better part of an hour, Marvin doesn't say anything. Everybody in the room gets quiet because everybody in the room, without saying a word, everybody in the room needed to know what Marvin was going to say. Why? Because he had the political experience, because he had been around, involved in the Atlantic City agenda for all of his life, because he was close to Pat McGahn. His opinion was going to be worth more than anybody else's, certainly including mine. I'll paraphrase because I don't remember. The words I told you before about stick it up his ass, those are exact quotes. what this is a paraphrase. He stood up. He was across the table. He stood up and he looked at me and he said, I know more about this than anybody here. I know more about Pat McGahn than anybody here. I care more about you as my nephew than anybody here, except for your wife. And I'm looking at you and I'm telling you, you have no choice. You must run. And then he proceeded to explain from his perspective why I must run. And essentially, the substance of it was that this community could not afford to put a Pat McGahn in the same position that, as far as Marvin was concerned, Frank Farley had occupied. Being the powerful person that everybody in Atlantic City had to come to, or everybody outside of Atlantic City had to come to get anything done. And I was not of that ilk. That's not where I came from, and Marvin knew it, and everybody else knew it. My interest was not in the political power. My interest was in trying to make policy and make improvements for the people and the economy and whatnot. And I slept on that for overnight, literally one night, and decided, okay, here it is. And I went to see Joe McGahn the next day and I said, love you, thank you very much, I'm going to run for the Senate. I spent full two-year terms in the Assembly from 71, 73, and 75 elections. Then in 77, I was elected to a four-year term in the Senate. And then in 81, I was elected to a two-year term in the Senate, but I resigned to go on the bench after the first legislative session. So I spent a total of 11 years in the legislature. Well, I didn't. It was Joe Gannon I alluded to, but Dick Coffey was the administrative aide at the Senate, and he was a fabulous ally, terrific man. There were a number of legislators that I developed a close relationship with, and interestingly enough, in the year that we are having this conversation, in the political environment that we are having it, some of the people I developed the closest relationships to, personally and politically, were Republicans. You can't say that today. But in those days, in the Assembly, I was very close with a number of representatives all over the state. Jim Hurley in Cumberland later became my colleague on the Casino Control Commission. There were some assemblymen, Dick Cody, who later became a governor for a while, Marty Herman, Don Stewart, Jim Florio. These were all people that I developed close personal or political relationships with. When I got to the Senate, there were 40 members of the Senate, 39 others and me, which meant 38 others, me, and Joe Merlino, who was president of the Senate my first term, a close personal friend, a close political ally, and somebody that I trusted and loved as much as possible. And then there was Charlie Yates, and there was Marty Greenberg, and there were a number of others that I was able to develop very, very good relationships with. One of my better relationships, closer relationships, in the Assembly was with the Republican leader in the Assembly, who then became the Speaker of the Assembly for a little while, a fellow by the name of Tom Kean. And Tom Kean and I developed from day one a terrific personal relationship. We saw things, most of the time we saw things different politically, but where we could, we worked together.
He was against gambling.
He was very much against gambling, and I could never talk him out of that or talk him into being for it. But nevertheless, our relationship was terrific, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why. There were several reasons, but one of the reasons why was shortly after I took office, might have even been before I was sworn in, but at the beginning, I showed him a scrapbook that my grandmother had created for my grandfather, Perskie, about his public involvement. I still have the scrapbook. And in that scrapbook, from 1928, was a full-page advertisement in the local newspaper, the Press of Atlantic City, about what was called at the top a monster Republican rally. This was a 1928 November rally on the boardwalk in Atlantic City in favor of the Republican candidates. Why did I show it to Tom Kean as soon as I could make it possible? Because the Republican candidate for the United States Senate, who was seeking re-election, was his grandfather, Hamilton Kean, who won, and because the chairman of the monster Republican rally on the boardwalk in Atlantic City in 1928 was my grandfather. Bottom it said Joseph B. Perskie, chair. So I took the scrapbook to Trenton with me one day, and I stopped Tom, and I said, I want to show you something. And I showed him this, and the two of us laughed about it. We laugh about it to this day. Every time I see Tom, even now, all those years later, it's almost 50 years later, and we still comment about the fact that our grandfathers, for a moment in time, were doing together politically in 1928. Governor Byrne, from the very beginning, actually from literally the first day I met him, made it very clear to me that first he would support the concept of casino gambling, but second, as far as he was concerned, it was because of Atlantic City and for Atlantic City. So, and it had to be very carefully structured and controlled. Those were his parameters. And he said that in the course of the 1973 campaign when he was running the first time. Nobody paid too much attention to it in 1973 because it was such a far out idea and because there were so many other things going on in 1973 to pay attention to in the election. Then I remember 2 weeks after the election, as is always the case, there's a convention in Atlantic City for the League of Municipalities where all the municipal officials come. And the governor, in this case the governor-elect, always comes to that convention. And while he was here 2 weeks after the election in '73, somebody asked him, one of the reporters, I was standing next to him, one of the reporters asked him about casinos for Atlantic City, and he said the same thing that he had said in the campaign. As long as it's Atlantic City, as long as I can make sure that it's sufficient controls, and et cetera, I'm for it. And the next day, that was the headline story all over the state. And I called him and I said, I don't understand. Now keep in mind, I was 1973. I was 28 years old. I was 2 years in the legislature, very politically naive. And I said to him, I don't understand. I said, you've been saying this all summer and nobody paid any attention to it. Why is it now all over the state? And he said, because I never said it as governor. Oh, right. It's good to be the governor. It's good to be the friend of the governor. So, that's how we started. And in 1974, January of '74, I introduced into the Assembly, Joe McGahn introduced into the Senate, a proposal for a constitutional amendment for casinos for Atlantic City. We needed 3/5 of each house to get it on the ballot. That meant in an 80-member assembly, we needed 48 votes. And that meant in a 40-member Senate, we needed 24 votes. I had relatively no difficulty getting the 48 votes. I was into the 50s. I'm sorry. That sounded very egotistical. We had no trouble getting those votes. But when we got to the Senate, we had a problem. And the problem was that there were a number of members of the Senate who were prepared and, in fact, eager to support gambling for New Jersey, but not limited to Atlantic City. They wanted the ability to have it, particularly in 2 places. And without their votes, we didn't have 24. How are we going to get this on the ballot? Well, the only way we could figure out how to get it on the ballot was to make a kind of a compromise. Okay, the Constitution will say that gambling can go any place in New Jersey where the people of that municipality and the people of that county separately conduct a referendum and approve it. We were not happy about that, but that's the only way we were going to get 24 votes. I went to see the governor. Governor said, look, I'm not going to, the governor, keep in mind, doesn't have to sign this. When the legislature passes a proposed constitutional amendment, it goes right on the ballot without the governor's signature. But nevertheless, the governor is the governor. And if he's going to campaign against this in the fall, I've already learned from Governor Cahill, it'll never pass. So I go to see the governor and ask for his help. And in concern for Atlantic City, in concern for politically for me and some of the others, he said, look, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll keep my mouth shut. But if I am asked, I will say that if it passes at the polls, and if the legislature passes any legislation that authorizes it for any place other than Atlantic City, I will veto that legislation. That wasn't very helpful, but it was the most I could get. And it was in that form that the question went on the ballot. And the problem, as is very obvious, was then, is now, is that in '74, when it went on the ballot, what the people were being asked to do was to approve gambling. And they didn't want to do that for a variety of reasons. And when we went out to campaign for it, it was useless to talk about Atlantic City because the form of the question was on the ballot would have allowed it anywhere in the state where the people wanted it to be. So we had to try to sell the notion of bringing casinos to New Jersey. That idea didn't sell, couldn't have ever sold. And it went down by a 60 to 40 vote. Plan B, that went on the ballot in '76, okay. Number one, limited to Atlantic City. We went to the senators, the 4 senators whose votes we had needed and couldn't get, and said, look, we tried it your way, now you got to try it our way. Okay, we will. So we now had 24 votes. Limited to Atlantic City. Make it privately owned and operated instead of publicly owned and operated, because we had learned that we could now, in '74 we could never have sold that. Now in '76 we thought we could. And we made a number of other provisions. For example, our polling had showed that we had gotten clobbered in '74 with senior citizens. So we put a provision in the constitutional amendment in '76 to dedicate the revenues that the state would get from this to programs that would support senior citizens. Utility bills, property taxes, and the like. Again, you look back all these years later and you think, what was great, what worked, what was terrible, what didn't, what are you proud of? In the spring of '76, against a lot of odds and against a lot of people telling us we could never do it, the proposal that I had drafted and that Joe McGahn went along with got through the legislature, puts on the ballot in November of '76 a proposal to allow casinos for Atlantic City. The governor's all for it. We had done a lot of homework. Well, not yet, but now it's '76. It's May of '76. We're on the ballot, and we get together, and I'll tell you who in a second, to try to learn the lessons that we needed to learn from '74's failure. We got beat in '74. How are we going to win in '76? Well, one of the ways are we're going to change the message. Another way is that in '74, we had no professional structure, no organized campaign. Everybody went out and did his own thing. I remember going out and speaking to a number of groups in this county or that county in '74, trying to sell the idea. And this was at the same time that the legislature was struggling with a whole revision, the proposal to revise the tax structure in New Jersey, and I was out in front of that. And somebody asked me at one of the meetings, if we do this, will we not need the income tax in New Jersey? And I said, no. I said, it's got nothing to do with it. The income tax structure in New Jersey is what it is, and here's the problem, and this has got nothing to do with it. Well, last week I was at a meeting, and Gary Malaman from Atlantic City came up and said that if we pass the gambling for Atlantic City, we won't need to worry about an income tax in New Jersey. Okay. First lesson, change the proposal. Second lesson, get an organized political campaign together so that you can do this professionally. Third lesson, have a message. Make damn sure you know what the message is, and make damn sure that everybody who is out there selling this is selling the same message. So, all of the interests in Atlantic City get together. That includes the legislators, the mayor and commissioners of Atlantic City, the head of the Hotel Motel Association, the labor unions, political figures such as Pat McGahn, and a number of others. And as I think about it now, as I look around in my mind, as I look around that room in the mayor's office where we met every Tuesday, I still marvel, 76, so that's more than 40 years ago, I still marvel at the fact that the men, and unfortunately they were all men, the men in that room at that table, some of them were bitter.
Mildred Fox was one woman.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot her. Yes, she was. The people in that room, in many instances, were desperately, politically, and personally antagonistic to others in the room. I mean, there were not just Pat McGahn and me, there were other fights of that nature. And yet, from the day it got started to the day it ended, the Committee to Rebuild Atlantic City, the CRAC Committee as it was known, I've always been very grateful that we were not doing this for Asbury Park because it would have been the CRAP Committee. The CRAC Committee was a fabulous success, in part because, I've concluded many years later, everybody, and that included me, would have been necessarily on his or her best behavior because you didn't want to be the one that people pointed at and said later, if this failed, it failed because of you. So everybody at that table did everything they were supposed to do. And Frank Siracusa went out and raised the money. I sat down in May and spent 3 months in the summer writing the draft of what became the Casino Control Act. Pat McGahn was charged with the responsibility of finding somebody to run the campaign. And he found Sandy Weiner in San Francisco and brought him in to run the campaign. A fabulous choice. Couldn't have been better. One of the comments I remember hearing at the time, and it was a compliment, but it was said with a smile, we gave him an unlimited budget and he exceeded it. But he did a simply terrific job in organizing, in structuring. He set up a speakers bureau, which I chaired. He had tutoring lessons. If you wanted to go out, if you were Gary Malamet, or if you were Mildred Fox, or if you were whoever, and you wanted to go out to Salem County or Essex County or someplace and speak for this proposal, here's what you're going to say. Here are the questions. Here are the answers. You're going to stick to this script. And everybody did. Everybody did. And we sold one message. It was July, halfway between the start and the finish. I was sent one day to a Rotary or Lions Club or someplace up in Monmouth County, 150 people in the room. And I'm making my case for Atlantic City. And I'm looking out, you know, if you've been in politics, by that time I had been in politics for 5 years, you know an audience. If you're any good, you know an audience. And I'm looking out at this audience, and I know that not one of them is hearing me. You can just tell. Something's wrong here. And you have to look through your life at moments to find religion sometimes and to find the proof of the existence of a God. This is one of mine. All of a sudden, I literally stopped in the middle of a sentence. And I said to the people out there, show of hands, how many of you have ever been to Atlantic City? Every hand in the room went up. Show of hands, how many of you have been to Atlantic City in the last 10 years? 5, 10%. Hello. They don't have the vaguest idea. Their Atlantic City was 1940s and 50s. They don't have a clue of what I'm talking about. Thank you. I get in the car, I come home, I go to the headquarters, and I sit down with Sandy Weiner, and I tell him the story, and I said, here's what we've got to do. He then organizes what in those days, this is 1976, the technology was not then what it is now. I would have put everything online and had them link in. We did a series of slides to show the reality of what Atlantic City had become. And it was on the basis of those slides that we then went out for the rest of the campaign, August, September, October, and undertook the campaign. And then there was a punchline. Campaigned all over the state for that period of time, all those months. They sent me, most of the time, they sent me to the tougher ones because I was the most informed and I had written the bill that we were selling. And I could answer the questions comfortably. Week before the election, Sandy Weiner calls me up and he says, okay, I'm sending you, this is your last appearance. You're going to go to Ocean City, but that's easy. You're going to speak to the annual convention of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Well, okay, guess what? That's all right, because we don't have one vote in that room, and we are never going to get one vote in that room. It's fine. What he didn't tell me was that the chairperson of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a woman by the name of Jeanes, Jeanes, whose husband, Reverend Samuel Jeanes, was the state chairman of the Casinos No Dice Committee. He didn't tell me that. And he didn't tell me that I was going to debate Reverend Jeanes in front of the WCTU. Okay. So I get in my car and I go to Ocean City and I go up to the boardwalk. To this day, again, 40-some years later, I never see the Music Pier. I never see, as often as I go to Ocean City, which is several times a year, I look at the Music Pier and I would like to give it a hug. Go into the Music Pier and there are 500, 600 people in the room. Let me think a minute. 76, I was 31 years old. I was, by a full generation, the youngest person in sight. There was nobody in there that was anywhere near my age. And it was packed, and if you looked around the room, there weren't any of our constituencies in that room. People more likely than not to vote for casinos. Reverend Jeanes and I do our thing. This is a week before the election, Tuesday before the election. We do our thing, he does his, I do mine. I have my slides, I'm showing people. And I'm free and easy because as far as I'm concerned, I got nothing to lose. I'm not going to get any votes here anyway. Question and answer time. And 3, 4, 5 people get up, and they don't really want to ask questions. They just want to tell us how terrible an idea this is and how awful it would be and yada, yada, yada. I can still see her, all these years later, I can still see her. She was sitting right in front, not in the front row, but on a line with me, back of the room. A little old lady gets up. Very white hair, short white hair, had to be in her 70s. Of course, I am now too, but maybe older. Classic little old lady. They put a microphone in front of her. She says, I don't have any questions. She said, I just want to say, and she now goes on to say, I'm paraphrasing, that I've always loved Atlantic City. I've been there so many times. I went there with my husband. I love the boardwalk. I love it. And I am very, very distressed to hear you and see you tell me what you're telling me about Atlantic City. It breaks my heart. She did say it. That is a quote. It breaks my heart. And she said, if this is what it would take to bring Atlantic City back, as much as I don't like gambling and I would never go into a casino, if this is what it takes to save Atlantic City, I would vote for it. And she sits down. And there was a smattering, I would call it, of applause in the audience. All right? 5%, 10%, I don't know. But I almost jumped out of my chair. And we didn't have cell phones in those days, so I couldn't pick up a phone. I got in the car, I broke every speeding law that there is to get to the headquarters on Atlantic Avenue. And I walked in and I said to Weiner, this election is over. You can close the office, you can retire. We have won. What are you talking about? And I told him the story. And he said, you're right. Now, of course, he didn't close the office and we did everything we had to do, but I knew this election was won a week before because of my little old lady in Ocean City. In early '76, when we made a decision to try again, if you will, as I've mentioned, first we had to get it through the legislature, which we did. Then we had to organize a political operation, the crack committee, which we did. Then we had to go to court because there's a constitutional provision in New Jersey that says if a constitutional amendment is put before the people and voted down, a similar question can't be presented for a 3-year period. And we were trying to go after 2 years.
I forgot about that.
So we had to persuade the court that the question that we were proposing in '76 was sufficiently different from the one that had failed in '74 so as to permit it to go on the ballot. And we won that case. Then we had to write, one of the other lessons that we had learned from '74, apart from focusing on Atlantic City, was that people had all kinds of questions that we couldn't answer in '74. Well, how will this be organized? Who will run it? Who will control it? Who will make sure that the mob doesn't come in? Who's going to regulate it? How's it going to be regulated? Where are the casinos going to be located? We had to come up with answers to all of those questions. So the crack committee charged me with the responsibility in May, come up with a draft of a bill that we will go public with before the election. And then we will campaign on that bill, and there will be 2 reasons to do that. One, we will be able to focus people's attention all over the state on the exact details of the proposal so that they'll know exactly what they're voting on, and hopefully we'll make it positive enough that they'll like it. And secondly, and if not equally, even more importantly, if we do that, and if we put a proposal before the people before the election and they vote it in, then when we get to writing the law after the election, we will be, and everybody else will be, obligated to do what we said we were going to do. And nobody will have the right to come in, nobody will have the political ability to come in and mess around with us. A very important concept. So I spent the whole summer researching and writing with some help from some other people. I also consulted with people in Trenton and around the state. We collected casino legislation all over the world. In the United States, of course, that meant only Nevada. We also went to London, or not went to, but we got the statute out of London. We got the statute out of the islands. Every place where there was gaming regulation, we got the law sent to us. Now, of course, in those days, it was a little tougher than it is now. Now you go online. In those days, we had to do some other research. But we put it all together. We came up with a regulatory structure. We came up with a tax structure. We came up with some specifics about where the casinos would be located. We came up with requirements for what kind of licensure you needed to do what. We were motivated, of course, by persuading the people of New Jersey that this could be honestly run. Remember, think back to 1976. What was the environment, political environment in New Jersey and nationally as far as gambling was concerned? Well, gambling was perceived in those days as being a mob-run enterprise in Nevada. And the later, remember, the Godfather movie came out in 1972. That didn't help. It was a fabulous movie, but it didn't help in terms of that perspective. Okay, so gambling is a dirty industry. We're going to put it in Atlantic City. Well, guess what? In 1976, 4 of the previous 5 mayors of Atlantic City had gone to jail for corruption. Okay, so we're going to put a dirty industry in a dirty city. And oh, by the way, we're going to put it in a state where the United States Attorney has said several members of the New Jersey legislature are entirely too close to organized crime. So we're going to put a dirty industry in a dirty city in a dirty state. That was the political reality with which we had to deal in 1976. So we had to make sure that the legislation was tight as a tick. And we wrote the toughest bill that had ever been enacted anywhere in the world at that time. And by the way, as a compliment to what we did, since 1976, as other jurisdictions around the world, around the United States and around the world, have approved proposals for legalizing gaming, universally, they have stolen from the language of the New Jersey Casino Control Act, which is a great compliment. In any event, we put all that together. Now it's time to go public. We're going to go public in late September of 1976 with this proposal. And we're going to do it by having a press conference in Trenton. And at that press conference in Trenton, we're going to have Joe McGahn and Howard Kupperman and I, who are the three legislators from Atlantic County. And that was a 2-to-1 Democrat-Republican, so we needed a fourth member who would be another Republican. So we asked Barry Parker, a good friend of ours from Burlington County, a Republican who was all for us. So the four of us sat there at this press conference in Trenton, and we released this bill. And from that day in September to the election day, that bill formed the discussion and the debate all over the state. So it did what we wanted it to do. There are a couple of asterisks about that. The day before the press conference in Trenton, Sandy Weiner had said to me, and I agreed with him, we need to sit with the locals who are organizing here, who are raising the money, who are, the hotel owners and the business people, all of the people who are the crack committee and the responsible local people, and we need to tell them what we're going to be telling the people of the rest of the state. Very smart. Good idea. So Weiner organizes a lunch at the Marlboro Blenheim, 25, 30 people sitting around a long table. And these are the people that have put up the money, and these are the people that have hired Weiner, and these are the people that are supporting the whole thing. This is ground zero. And Weiner wants me to explain to them what this proposal is going to say. So I do. And I tell them that it's going to say that you need 500 rooms in a hotel, and that each of those rooms has to be 325 square feet large, and this, and you're going to have so many square feet of entertainment space, and so many square feet of convention space, and you're going to have this and that. Well, you should understand that no hotel in Atlantic City came close to those requirements. There was not a 500-room hotel in it. There were 1 or 2 500-room hotels, but none of them was 325 feet. None of them had the series of requirements that we were imposing, which meant, to the amazement of the people in that room, that not one of those hotels in Atlantic City today is going to be eligible for a casino. If you want a casino in your hotel, you're going to have to spend a lot of money, and you're going to have to do a lot of work to upgrade and modernize your facility. That was the unspoken message of what I was telling them. And I sit here today, again, 40-some years later, with the memory of that afternoon, thinking today how lucky I was to get out of that room alive. Okay? You can only imagine how angry and frustrated and disappointed and enraged all these people were. How dare you? I'm not going to use the kind of language they used, but they were stunned. And they were going to take it out on me, and they were going to stop raising money for the campaign, and they were going to do all very negative. Fella down at the other end of the table, elderly, quiet, doesn't say a word, listens to all of this for 15, 20 minutes. Then he stands up. Again, just the way my Uncle Marvin had stood up that night about me running. His name was Fisher White. He owned the Marlboro Blenheim, he and his family. They had been in Atlantic City and in the hotel business in Atlantic City for generations. They were devout Quakers, very religious people. And again, I'll paraphrase, not quote. He said, I need to say this. He said, none of this matters to me in terms of me and my family. If this passes, and if casinos come to Atlantic City, we're going to sell the hotel and leave, because we would not be, for religious reasons, we would not be prepared to be involved in casinos in any event. But all of you his colleagues, his fellow hotel owners, all of you are completely wrong. And the attitudes that you're talking about today are the reasons that Atlantic City has gotten to where it's gotten. You're being very selfish, you're being very short-sighted, you're being very narrow-minded. Perskie and the people that put this together are right. If Atlantic City is going to come back, it's got to be because you do what he's talking about doing and because Atlantic City gets sold as a queen of resorts. And he says, if you don't do this, you're not going to win anyway. And nobody had an answer for him because of the way, the unselfishness with which he was making the case. So they grumbled and they yelled and they did and they groused, and they probably figured that after the election they could fix it because Pat McGahn was telling them he could. So they went along with it, reluctantly, with a couple of exceptions. Milt Neustaedter and Sonny Goldberg at what was then the Howard Johnsons were all in. They agreed with it. So did a couple of the others. But for the most part, the hotel owners were beside themselves with anger. So now the legislation, the constitutional amendment passes in November of '76. The next Monday, I introduced the bill that we had drafted into the Assembly. The governor assigns a task force from the Attorney General's office and from the Department of Commerce and from the Department of Transportation and from everybody else that would be involved. The governor creates a task force to spend the next several months reviewing the draft. They had already looked at it before the election, but reviewing the draft and making whatever recommendations they want to make. It takes from November to March, or April. The night it passed, there was we knew it was going to pass, as I told you. Apart from my little old lady in Ocean City, Weiner had been doing polling and we had been getting feedback from the various counties. We knew we were in good shape. So there was a party organized at Howard Johnson's. And there were, I don't know how many thousand people there. I mean, it was a festivity. And you have to remember, again, who you're talking to. You're talking to somebody who got into this whole business for the political side of it. All right? I got in it to do local politics. I became county chairman to structure this political system. That was my heart and soul at the beginning. This is 1976. It's a presidential election year. It took me until 2:30 in the morning. 2:30 in the morning before, oh, wait a minute. Who got elected president? Didn't even think about it.
That's great.
Okay? I remember that as well. So we were on a high that night. Obviously, the entire city and the entire community. And it was wonderful. And then we started the legislative and the administrative process. It gets to April of 1977. The bill had been assigned to the Assembly State Government Committee, chaired by Assemblyman Richard Cody from Essex County. Was then, today in my mind, is a giant. People never gave him the credit I believe he deserved as being a serious, solid legislator. He says to me, here's what we're going to do. And this bill was over 100 pages. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and we're going to have the staff aide to the committee read every word of the bill, paragraph by paragraph, and anybody that wants to comment, any member of the committee or any member of the public that wants to comment on that paragraph will do so. I was in the legislature for 11 years. I have watched the legislature for the last 30 or 40. And I promise you, no other bill in the history of New Jersey has ever gone through that type of process. And he did exactly what I just said. Wayne Bockelman, who was his staff aide, would read paragraph by paragraph. A lot of them people didn't have questions. A lot of them did. I was there every minute. My legislative aide was with me. So was the media. So were Jack Davis and the other people from resorts. So were all kinds of interests. When it got to the enforcement sections, the Attorney General showed up through Bob Martinez and several others, and they had their input. Well, we recommend strengthening this, we think that. There was a suggestion that somebody had made not to allow credit. No, we're going to allow credit. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to regulate credit. Every detail of that bill took from Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Committee adjourns on Friday at 5, and the Assembly is going to vote on the bill on Monday. But on Friday at 5, there was still a huge amount of work to be done, because the committee would say, okay, Wayne being the staff aide, we want this provision to say thus and such. Wayne would take notes. Okay. But the words weren't there yet. The committee was dealing with policy. So it's 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. The bill has to be ready at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. Now, what else? As it happens, not my planning, on Saturday, at a hotel in Atlantic City, the Atlantic County Democratic Committee is going to get together and nominate candidates for the next election, including, among others, the state Senate seat. Joe McGahn and I are going to be at that convention competing for the convention's endorsement on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. I persuade the committee staff to stay after 5 o'clock on Friday. I will stay with you, and we will work on this. And we will get it ready, because I have to leave. I can't come back tomorrow. I got to be in Atlantic City tomorrow to run for office. The committee staff and I got together at 5:30 on Friday night, and we finished at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. I have been told by the committee staff that in the history of the Legislative Services Agency, no legislator ever stayed overnight and worked with the staff line by line on every word of the bill. We finished the work at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. I got in the car, I drove home, took a shower, and went to the convention. And on Monday morning, the bill was presented in the Assembly for a vote. Then it turned out that we couldn't vote it that day because there were a couple of guys from North Jersey who wanted to add some additional language on minority participation, which I didn't have any problem with. They hadn't had enough sense to ask me about it ahead of time, or maybe they wanted to make a show of it, whatever. They wanted to make an amendment to what the committee had done to add some language on minority hiring. Fine. So we put that language in that day, and the next session of the Assembly is when it came up for a vote. That was my all-night session. Yes, but, okay? I wouldn't today, knowing everything that has happened, I wouldn't have changed anything that we did in '77. I think that what we did was exactly what we needed to do in terms of achieving the public's confidence and support for the integrity of the structure, for making sure that the economics and the regulatory structure were as they needed to be. As it happened, when we did that in 1977, I had no way of knowing that 13 years later, I would be assigned to the Casino Control Commission. And when I got to the Casino Control Commission 13 years later, the world had changed. The economy was different. The environment was different. We had learned through 13 years of experience a lot of things that we didn't know in 1977. So when I got to the commission in 1990 and 91, I went back to the legislature, this time as the chairman of the commission with the support of my colleagues on the commission, and I said to the legislature, here are, I don't remember how many, dozens of changes that we would like to make in the Casino Control Act. Now here I was proposing changes in my own legislation, and I don't apologize for that, because over 13 years, realities had changed, and we had learned a lot of things. Wow. The short answer is I agree with Governor Byrne's regret. I need to explain what happened, why it didn't happen. You asked me a minute ago if the legislation had accomplished its goals, and I said, in a manner of speaking. The goal was to invite the industry to come to New Jersey, to Atlantic City, to operate pursuant to our regulatory system and control, to operate the industry honestly and with integrity, and to invest a whole lot of money in Atlantic City and New Jersey. The industry did every bit of that. What in 1977 we didn't know enough about was the responsibility of government, city and state. Let me try to give you a big picture with respect to why the governor in 77 suggested a superagency approach and why it didn't happen and what the consequences of why it didn't happen. As we've already mentioned, Atlantic City's government had a very dirty history. Before and after the referendum, mayors went to jail. That by itself, well, that was clearly a political problem, but that wasn't, at least in my view, then or now, that wasn't the source of the governmental failures that I am now trying to describe. We invited the industry to come in here on the terms that I've identified, and the industry did. What our expectations were, naive as they were in 77, was that the city and the state governments would perceive the necessity for each of them to do what they had to do and would get in line and do it. I wasn't concerned at that time, and I don't think the governor was, about questions of personality. We weren't focused at that time on this mayor or that commission or that city council. It was a commission at the time. As much as we were on the concept that this is what Atlantic City would need to do, this is what the state would need to do. The governor's approach was to suggest a state agency, such as the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission, that would replace the city, and for that matter the county, in terms of the responsibility for coordinating and developing the governmental approaches to things. In the light of history and in the light of hindsight, I am very sorry that I was one of the ones that succeeded in talking the governor out of that approach and in favor of a different approach that I will describe in a minute. In retrospect, and again armed with the lessons of history, that would have been, I think, at least as good, if not a better, approach than the one we took. I'll tell you in a minute why it was, but what is the one that we took? The one that we took was to create a series of other agencies. The Atlantic County Transportation Authority was created and armed with the power to coordinate transportation development in the area and throughout the county, in the city and throughout the county. The Atlantic County Improvement Authority was invested with significant new powers in terms of housing and in terms of urban redevelopment and the like. The New Jersey Exposition Authority was given significant, by statute, was given significant new powers with respect to the maintenance and development and the expansion of the Atlantic City Convention Center. All of these things done, by the way, over the objections of the government in Atlantic City. But our approach was that we would deal with these issues severally by investing existing or new agencies with significant new powers. Some of that worked and worked well, some of it didn't. And I'll tell you in a minute what didn't and why it didn't. But backing up a minute, why did we make that approach instead of the one the governor was suggesting? And the answer was that it was my view and that of a number of others that from a political point of view, we couldn't get away with it, at least and survive. Again, if you look at it in 2019, the concept of the state coming in and effectively running Atlantic City is a reality that no one reasonably can dispute at this point. In 1977, that wasn't the case. You didn't have Camden, you didn't have Newark, You didn't have the other areas in the state at that point that the state had come in and fixed problems. So the concept of the state coming in and running Atlantic City, from a political point of view, was a very hot potato. And I was afraid of it personally, and I didn't, at that time, agree with it substantively. And I talked the governor, I and a number of others talked the governor out of it. I'm now sorry that we did. Now, that having been said, was what we did do workable? And the answer is yes, but. It was workable if the leadership in Atlantic City and if the leadership in Trenton had wanted it to be workable. Now I'll tell you another story that makes my point. It's November of 1989. It's 2 weeks after the gubernatorial election of 1989, in which Jim Florio is elected to succeed Tom Kean, who has served the last 8 years. Tom Kean invites Jim Florio to his office in Newark to meet with me and Tom Kean's chief of staff. I was, at that point, the chief of staff designate. The four of us are going to sit in Kean's office in Newark for an afternoon, and we're going to do a survey of the state of New Jersey. An afternoon that, again, I will never forget. And we talked about everything you can think of to talk about. We talked about the environment. We talked about taxes. We talked about crime. We talked about Hudson County. We talked about the bridges, long before there was Bridgegate. Everything you can think of that an outgoing governor wants to brief an incoming governor on, or an incoming governor wants to ask an outgoing governor about. And remember, Tom told you Tom Kean was a friend of mine, was then, is now. Tom Kean, in my view then and in my view now, was a terrific governor. Okay, I think he did a great job. At some point in the conversation, it turns to Atlantic City. It's on somebody's list. What do we do about Atlantic City? Now keep in mind that this conversation takes place when the then mayor of Atlantic City is under indictment. And the previous mayor is already in jail, Michael Matthews. Atlantic City comes up on the agenda, and Tom kind of looks over at me with a sort of a sheepish look, almost as if to say, I'm sorry. But then he talks to Jim Florio, and he says, look, he says, I got to tell you, he said, from the minute I took office, I was petrified of Atlantic City. I didn't want to get anywhere near it because I was scared to death that sooner or later, something like what has now happened would happen. And he said, I made up my mind to stay as far away from it as I could. And it made me want to cry when he said that. Because he was and is a good man, was and is a good governor. And I understood what he was saying at an intellectual and a political level. But I said to myself at that moment, and I have said to myself in the 20 years since then, 30 years since then, Tom, if only you had taken it in your hands and decided that in the 1980s, when it was most important to do so, you needed to take it, forget whether it's one state agency or it's 6 different agencies, the state has to come in here and define what we are looking for and then make it happen. Now, I blame Tom and the state government. I blame equally as much the city government, whose attitude was, in those early years, in the 80s, when it was most important, the attitude of the government of Atlantic City was to the state of New Jersey, you stay the hell out of here. This is our city, we're going to run it, and we're going to do it our way. And the state government said, okay. Now, I blame both of them for that, and the county government said, what? What? Where? What? Atlantic City? What? Where? So nobody in government, in my view, then and in my view now, discharged the responsibilities that were so fundamentally necessary for the success. So to the extent that there are failures, and God bless there are, to the extent that our original concepts and goals have not been achieved, and there are, that's not, in my view, the responsibility of the casino industry, which did everything we asked them to do. It is the result of the failure of government at every level to do what they had to do. Now, Jim Florio takes office in 1990. It's 9 years later. I'm fortunate to be chief of staff. We organize an effort in 1990 that succeeded for the next few years of his administration. He forms a task force on Atlantic City. It's chaired by George Zoffinger, who is the chairman of the Department of Commerce. The new mayor of Atlantic City, Jim Whelan, is on board.
And Jim was honest, too.
And indeed, but it's more important. Look, his honesty is terribly important and a testament to him, but it isn't what made the difference. What made the difference is that he was prepared to work with the state and to cooperate, have the city government and the state government joining hands in sharing responsibilities and in identifying the agenda that had to be pursued. So, it's a long way of answering your question, did we meet our goals? For all of the people who say you didn't succeed in doing for Atlantic City what, gambling didn't succeed in doing for Atlantic City what was projected to do, while there is some real truth to that, I respond by saying two things. Number one, close your eyes and imagine Atlantic City today without ever having had casino gaming. What would it look like? And the question answers itself. It would be a bedraggled version of Asbury Park or Wildwood. And the second thing that I say is, in spite of all of the failures, in spite of the proliferation of gaming around the country, if not the world, in spite of the economic recession that took place in the late 2000s, 2008, 2010, 2012, and the complete reconstruction of the gaming industry, consolidation of the gaming industry and expansion of it, proliferation. In spite of all of that, Atlantic City today, as we sit here in this conversation, is economically healthy. The casino industry is strong. It is smaller than it was, but that's got nothing to do with the failures in Atlantic City. That has to do with the nature of the gaming business, with the rapid expansion of internet gaming. You can now sit in your own living room in most places in the country, and you don't have to get in your car and go anywhere in order to participate in gaming. Atlantic City's gaming industry is smaller than it was, but it is fundamentally sound and healthy and employs thousands and thousands of people that otherwise wouldn't be working. Now, is there a lot of work left to be done in terms of both the city and the state, the city of Atlantic City and the state of New Jersey? Absolutely. Is what Governor Christie started and what Governor Murphy is following through on helping? You bet it is. Is it getting far enough, fast enough? Of course not. But the state isn't, in my opinion, nobody has told me anything from Trenton, but in my opinion, the state is not going to walk away from the position it has taken with respect to Atlantic City until there is a general consensus locally and in Trenton that it can safely do so, and that consensus does not exist today. The problem, in my opinion, is not because City Hall was corrupt. The problem, in my view...
What do you say to the dysfunctionality?
Yes, the problem is that they were incompetent. And incompetent means, in this instance, not that they were corrupt. That is the reality that it is, and it certainly can't be defended in any context. But if they were totally honest, and otherwise everything was the same, it still would have not worked at the city level, because when I use the word incompetent, I mean they lacked the vision and the political strength and vision to do what needed to be done. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. And this goes, I mean, what year am I talking? I'm talking 1978, 79. I'm in the Senate. We are enacting the various agencies that I've described to take control of things. We have a bill in, I have sponsored a bill to give the State Sports and Exposition Authority ownership and control over the Atlantic City Convention Center. Part of the effort I'm talking about. Literally in the exact same week that my bill is introduced and set up for a hearing in the Senate, the mayor of Philadelphia, Wilson Goode, is appearing at a hearing in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to plead with the legislature in Pennsylvania to take over the Philadelphia Convention Center, because the mayor of Philadelphia is arguing The Philadelphia Convention Center is beyond the capacity of the taxpayers of Philadelphia to support, and it is an important state asset. That's what the mayor of Philadelphia is telling the legislature in Harrisburg. The mayor of Atlantic City, on the other hand, hires a former state senator by the name of McGahn to serve as his lobbyist and go to Trenton to argue against my bill because the state of New Jersey has no business coming in and taking over the convention center. Now, it wasn't because the mayor of Atlantic City was corrupt. That mayor was not. That mayor was an honest man. He was, in my view, incompetent, but he was an honest man. So my problem is not with the corruption. The corruption is an inherent problem, or was an inherent problem as it was. But if they had been completely honest with the same lack of vision and the same selfishness that they showed at that time, we would have still seen the same thing. Now, my bill got passed anyway, even over the city's objection. But every step along the way was met with that resistance by the city. And then when Tom Kean became governor, and for his own reasons, as I've said, pulled back, the Atlantic City, you should forgive the expression because I know it's an oxymoronic term, the leadership in City Hall in Atlantic City took control. Now, the fact that they were corrupt didn't adversely affect, I mean, yes, it adversely affected, but if they had been honest, they would have still had the same political selfishness and short-sightedness. You're right, and I had this discussion with my dear friend and one-time colleague, Chuck Worthington, who had run with me and got elected in '73 to the Assembly, and then from '75 to '83 was the Atlantic County Executive, a fact that I was then and am still very proud of. He did a great job. But Chuck, partly because he was in a politically difficult situation. He was a Democrat executive with a Republican board, and he could never persuade the board to be as aggressive as he might have wanted it to be, and I'm not sure that he even wanted to be as aggressive as I wanted him to be. But the county government, in my view then, and in my view today, has a major role, or potentially a major role, that it could have and could be playing. When he left in '83 and was succeeded by Dick Squires, a good man, an honest man, a good man, Dick Squires' view was 180 degrees opposite to what I'm describing here. Dick Squires was looking, and his successor, also a good man and an honest man, their view is to keep county government as small and as isolated as it can be. And I rigorously and vehemently disagree with that. I think that for a variety of different reasons, not just what's going on in Atlantic City, but otherwise in terms of the cost of government and consolidation of function and whatnot, county government has a very, very important potential role to play. But unless you have leadership, both at the executive office and on the freeholder board, you can't make that happen. And we never had that. We never had county government in a position of standing up and saying, hey, Atlantic City is missing the boat here. The government of Atlantic City is missing the boat here. Governor, whoever, the county is ready to help step in. Let's do it. Now, again, I say all of that with regret for the notion that in hindsight, 2020 hindsight being the sharpest vision ever, if the governor had fulfilled his original goal of setting up a state agency to run everything, you wouldn't have needed the political support from Atlantic County or Atlantic City. But you did need the political support from Atlantic City and Atlantic County, and it was never there. I think that's almost a fair statement. It was kept alive. It was dramatically improved. It wasn't reborn in the sense that the original Atlantic City, going back into the 30s and 40s, didn't have then, I'm going to give myself an asterisk before I finish the sentence, didn't have then the same type of day and night concept that you have today. What do I mean by that? You've got a very healthy casino industry, you got thousands of people working, you got a new convention center, you got a new downtown, And yet you have, as Nelson Johnson has pointed out, areas of the city where it never happened, where it's as if it never happened. You have that. That's what I mean by night and day. In the original Atlantic City, going back before the Second World War and shortly thereafter, you still had night and day from a sociological perspective. You had very clear black-white lines, and I mean that literally, and you had poor people, but you had a somewhat more homogeneous economic environment when the city was at its peak than you have today. Today you have haves and have-nots more than you had then. So did casino gambling address all those issues? By no means. Are we better off for having it be here? Absolutely. Did it have the potential to do a lot more? Yes, if there had been the public sector commitment to doing what had to be done. You would have had to have stepped on a lot of toes. The mere creation of a state agency would have stepped on a frightful number of toes. But in my view now, it would have done a better job on the lines that we're talking about than the approach that we wound up taking with the different agencies doing the different things. The common denominator still has to be that you needed, and we never had, a political commitment in Atlantic City and to a lesser extent in Atlantic County to invest the resources of the governments of those two entities in making Atlantic City reborn. The economics for a time were there. Now, what do I mean when I say for a time? The key period of time during which I perceive that the greatest opportunity to do what needed to be done and what those opportunities were missed were the period from '78 when it started to the early '90s when the national recession came in and put a brake on investment and expansion and whatnot. It was in the period of the '80s and early '90s when the economic and sociological opportunities were at their peak that the political structures did not do what, in my view, they had to do. Now, when you get into the '90s, you start the '90s with a recession, which chills everything. And then when the recession ends, by the end of the '90s, you got the beginning of a different climate in the gaming industry and in the political environment of the gaming industry, by which I mean what? By the end of the '90s and into the first decade of the 2000s, you started with the proliferation of jurisdictions that were going to be offering gambling. You had Indian casinos in a number of different places. You had several states starting to legalize. The phrase I use is Wall Street and Main Street. When we started in 1976 and opened in '78, as I've already indicated, casino industry was a dirty industry in a dirty city in a dirty state. So we had to prove, for our own purposes, forget anybody else, that you could keep the industry clean and that you could operate it with integrity. We did that in spades. We did that so well, that we cleansed the casino industry of the black cloud that hung over it on Wall Street and Main Street, by which I mean political people all over the country, in legislatures and in city governments, were saying, hey, wait a minute, we can control this, we can keep it honest. And Wall Street was saying, hey, wait a minute, we can invest in that kind of business because we have the protections of the regulatory process that will make sure that we're not going to sleep with dirty people. So all of a sudden, an industry that couldn't be legitimately financed and wasn't politically acceptable anywhere, as a result of what we did in New Jersey and in Atlantic City, was acceptable now to Wall Street and Main Street. That meant that we were creating our own competition. Now, we could have done, notwithstanding that, and we should have expected that, as some of us were saying at the time, be careful, the more successful we are, the more competition we are going to engender for ourselves. Notwithstanding the proliferation, we could have done a dramatically better job than we did in realizing our potential in the period of time that I'm talking about. But that was, in my view, the wasted time. That's why was ready to cry when Tom Kean said, "I walked away." I have no apologies and I never will, for undertaking this effort and for expecting of it what we did. Our expectations were reasonable. To the extent they weren't achieved, and they haven't been to this day, they are, in my view, attributable to what we're talking about, the political failures for the key periods of time. The industry did everything we wanted. We wanted them to come in here and pour barrels and barrels and barrels of money into the community. They did. We wanted them to run it honestly. They have. Okay? They did everything. We wanted them to hire local people and do business with local businesses. They did, and they do. This is not an industry failure by any means. The original projections, when we did the 1976 referendum, we hired a consulting firm, Sandy Weiner, hired a consulting firm to come in here and make an analysis for the campaign. Economic Research Associates. How much?
I forget the numbers, but I remember.
I'll tell you the numbers. Yeah. And the numbers were that in a 5-year period, there could be $2 to $3 billion invested in Atlantic City, and it would generate something in the neighborhood of $500 million a year in taxes. They were only off by about 300%. Okay, it was over $6 billion that got invested in that period of time, with tax revenues of several hundred million. Okay, so the casino industry is not at fault here. Never was. Well, no, I take that back. In terms of what we've been talking about, they were not responsible. They had their own, the leadership of the casino industry, which were a bunch of terrifically smart, focused people, had the problem, at least in those days, and as far as I know, many of them still do, that their definition of long-term strategy is the next quarter. They don't think past the next quarter. And that's a shame, but it's a short-sightedness that is common to many industries, not just the casino industry. But I don't blame the casino industry for what failures we have been discussing here. I blame the failure of the governmental institutions to recognize the potential and to make the tough political decisions that would have been needed to make in order to realize that potential, when it was critical to do so. Oh my goodness. I was kind of hoping you might forget that. That was before I became involved as I did with the casinos, that was the apex of my political identity. When I was first elected in 1971 and took office in January of '72, I became a member of the Assembly Taxation Committee, and then 2 years later I became the chairman of the Assembly Taxation Committee. It was at a time when New Jersey's state government, as always, was in a terribly dangerous and inefficient status. The governor at the time, Governor Cahill, had commissioned a policy group, before I got elected, had commissioned a policy group to make recommendations for how to fix the broken state government finances. His commission recommended in 1972, when I was first in office, a whole bunch of changes which included the enactment of a personal income tax in New Jersey. New Jersey was at that time one of the 2 states in the nation that didn't have an income tax, only 2. Well, as you might imagine, in 1972, a proposal to enact a state income tax was not popular. And in fact, it wound up costing Governor Cahill his own party's renomination the next year. He is the only governor in recent history to have been denied a nomination by his own party. But the governor followed through on the recommendations of his commission, and he instituted a proposal in the Assembly to enact a state income tax. The Assembly was at that time controlled by the Republicans. I was a member of the Assembly Committee, but not in the majority. The bill did, in fact, because the governor insisted on it, The bill did get out of committee and onto the floor. It needed 41 votes to pass and go to the Senate. It got 11. 11 votes out of 80. I was one of the 11. A vote that I was promised in my first year, a vote that I was promised would cost me my political future. But I thought it was right. I didn't think it was the best version of an income tax proposal I could have seen. I could have made a number of suggestions for changes in it. But it would have, had it been enacted, in my view, have been a positive from a policy point of view. I also knew that the people that were telling me that I had just committed political suicide were probably right. What I didn't know, and nobody else knew, was that a year later, by the time my name would be on the ballot in 1973 for re-election, a couple of things had happened between 72 and 73. Watergate is the name that I'm thinking of. And by November of 73, after the full Watergate, after the Saturday Night Massacre, after all of these things, the Democratic candidate for governor of New Jersey won by a record majority and took with him an overwhelming Democratic majority in both houses of the state legislature, including re-electing me, notwithstanding that I had voted for the income tax. Now, what that meant to me, well, there was another incident that I'll tell you about in a second, but what it meant to me was that now I was politically free. I had voted for the income tax and gotten away with it politically, not because people loved me, but just simply because I was running in a watershed year. But it gave me the political freedom for the rest of my career to be able to say and do whatever I thought was right and not worry about the politics. And how did I know that? Another funny story that you can't make it up because it can't happen this way. It was late in the campaign in 73. Everybody in the state of New Jersey was running away from the income tax issue, including Brendan Byrne, who would later the next year go on to introduce it and eventually sign it. But when he was campaigning in 73, as not the incumbent, when asked about it, he would say, well, I'm not for it. I think we ought to try to explore all kinds of alternatives. I mean, it was nonsense. I had no choice. I had already voted for Cahill's bill, so I was stuck with it. But during the course of the campaign, I did the very best I could to try to hide from that, because I was very young politically and not very self-confident about it. And until it got to the end and we knew Watergate was going to do what it was going to do, I really thought that I was in trouble politically. So it's towards the end of the campaign. There is a debate in Linwood, sponsored by the League of Women Voters, when I'm meeting my opponents, and we debate all the issues. And we're standing, it's on a Sunday night. I don't know why, but it was on a Sunday night. That becomes important. And after the debate, we're standing around having coffee, and I'm chatting with some of the women voters. And standing behind me, whom I do not recognize, is a reporter for the Atlantic City Press. I do not recognize him because the regular political reporter for the Atlantic City Press, a fellow that I knew very, very well, and you might remember his name is Frank Prendergast, he was on vacation because it was a Sunday night, and so they sent somebody else who I didn't know. He was standing behind me, and he was listening to me. And I was explaining to the women voters, as I had not had the courage to explain at the microphone, why I had voted the previous year for the income tax, and why I thought it was right, and why I thought it was better, and yada, yada. And he's standing behind me taking notes. And the next day, on Monday morning, the headline across the newspaper in Atlantic City, Perskie income tax, whatever it was. If I'd had a sharp razor, I'd have slit my throat. I got calls all day from all over the state, including Brendan Byrne. What are you doing? What's wrong with you? How can you possibly be standing up and saying that a month before the election? Oh, well, I was too lazy to look around. I get a call that afternoon from Frank Prendergast, who I had known for several years. I see you've been busy over the weekend. What are you going to do? He says to me. I said, I don't have a clue. He said, you want some advice? I said, yeah. He said, sit down with me, go on the record, and say everything you need to say and answer all of my questions. You're in for a dime, in for a dollar. Or in the language my kids use today, go all in. I didn't have a better idea. I sat down with him 2 days later for 3 hours, whatever it was. Went through the entire thing, detail, why, how, what. He wrote it all up the next day. And then a couple of days later, the press ran an editorial. The headline in the editorial was, "Save That Neck." And the editorial started off by saying, Assemblyman Stephen P. Perskie has stuck his neck out a mile by doing the do-do-do-do. And they proceed to go through everything that I said, what they agreed with, what they didn't agree with, and they didn't agree with some of it. But they go through the whole thing. Then they get to the end of the editorial and they say, regardless of what you think on the merits, I'm paraphrasing now, you can go get the editorial, I have it somewhere. Regardless of what you think on the merits, Perskie deserves a lot of credit for being honest and for standing up and saying what he actually thinks in the face of a political campaign where it's not very popular. He stuck his neck out a mile. Save that neck. We endorse Perskie for re-election. Well, the editorial by itself didn't get me elected. What got me elected was Richard Nixon and Watergate, and Brendan Byrne and everything else. Every Democrat in sight got elected from any tough district. But what it did was create for me, totally by accident, the public persona that I wasn't afraid to tell the truth. And that whatever came up, I would tell the truth and the political consequences be damned. To my credit, and I'm bragging, I did recognize at the moment that that had happened. And I took advantage of it for the next 8 years of my political career. Never bothered me anymore. People would say, oh, that's just Perskie, he says what he thinks. And I never paid any political price thereafter that I knew of for telling the truth. And I would like to say that I had planned it that way. I didn't, but I am proud to say I took advantage of it when I saw it. Oh, that's another moment of my political life that I'm so happy and proud about. At the time that I was elected, New Jersey had, of course, the Superior Court system that we have today. We also had an administrative system called the Bureau of Tax Appeals that existed to hear and decide real estate tax appeals. And it was done by people, political people who had been appointed by various governors. It was not very sophisticated, it was not very efficient, at least in my view. And I wanted to change that and to have all of that moved into the court system and to create a New Jersey tax court that would be, governors would appoint judges that would be the same quality as judges of the Superior Court with the same degree of professionalism and expertise, and they would be experts in tax law and in real estate assessments, and they would administer it through the substance and the procedure of the tax court system. And I sponsored that when I was first elected in '72, got nowhere. Sponsored it again in '74 when Byrne came in, got nowhere in the Assembly. Got elected to the Senate in '78, sponsored it again. Now, because I have a friend in the governor's office, I'm getting some attention. The court system was against it. The Chief Justice was against it. The administrative director of the courts was against it because they didn't want to assume the additional responsibility. So the governor's got me on one side, he's got the Chief Justice and the court on the other side, and I'm nagging for the bill. So I go to Trenton one day, and I'm doing whatever I'm doing, and somebody from the governor's office comes over to me and he says, the governor would like you to come to his office at 12:30 today, bring a sandwich or whatever. He wants to talk to you about the tax court. Terrific. I'm thrilled. So 12:30, I grab a sandwich, I grab my legislative aid, and we go over to the governor's office and we walk in, and who's sitting there but the Chief Justice, Governor Hughes, an old friend as I've indicated, and the administrative director of the court, a brilliant judge. He had been recognized by everybody, me included, as being one of the smartest men in the state. I don't know that they're going to be there for this discussion. Nobody bothered to tell me that. I was figuring I'd just come in and explain to the governor why I wanted the bill. Here's the Chief Justice and the administrative director. Governor walks in with his counsel, Dan O'Hearn, who later becomes a Supreme Court Justice himself. Governor walks in, looks at us, laughs, and he says, "You may enter your appearances." Now, what did he mean by that? The governor himself was a former judge. Here he walks in, sitting in his chair as if it were a bench, a judge's bench, and he's got in front of him the lawyers who are going to argue a case. And the first thing you say to the lawyers is, "Good morning, enter your appearances. I'm Stephen Perskie, I represent so." So the governor comes in and he says, "Enter your appearances." Well, that means, and I've already figured it out, that we're going to have a debate in front of the governor. I'm going to be debating the Chief Justice. Well, as it turns out, the Chief Justice, I figured it out many months later, Chief Justice agreed with me, but he wasn't ready to say so because his administrative director was so against it. Now I'm going to be debating the director, who's one of the smartest men in the state, without any preparation. One of the best moments, one of the best days of my life. Got no publicity, shouldn't have, because nobody in my district really gave a damn about whether we had a tax court or we didn't. I did it because I believed it was right and I thought it was important. For an hour, we debated the issue, the director and I. The governor and Dan O'Hearn occasionally would throw in a question. Why this, why that, why not do this, why do that? And we get all finished and the governor says, "Okay," he says, "I'll get back to you in a few days." And the next week I get a call from Dan O'Hearn. Governor says, "Move the bill." And the bill got enacted and it's worked and the tax court got created. It moved into the tax system. The administrative director of the courts, "Okay, I'll do it." You had no choice. But they've done a good job with it, and it has dramatically improved the system. For me, it was a moment. I didn't get any political credit for it, and shouldn't have. I mean, there were no reporters there, and I would certainly never have gone out and issued a press statement that I had debated the administrative director. But I did a real good job that day. And then the final coda, that was 1978, 79, somewhere around there. I kept in touch with Brendan Byrne for the rest of his life. And at some point, it's within the last 10 years, so it would have been 30 some years later, we were having lunch. And just on a shot, I mean, he was at that point in his late 80s. Yeah, 88, 89 years old, and frail. And I said, "Governor, let me ask you something." I said, "Do you remember the conversation that I had in your office about the tax court with," and that's as much as I got out of my mouth. He said, "Oh my goodness," he says, "you had Hughes and you had Gormley." He said, "That was terrific. You did a great job that day." It doesn't get any better than that. It just doesn't. I had known for most of my adult life, probably even before I was technically an adult. I mean, my grandfather was a Supreme Court justice. My father had wanted to be a judge all of his life and eventually succeeded. I was eagerly committed to the concept of the practice of law, and I enjoyed it when I started it, and I enjoyed trying cases, and I did a lot of tax work, and I had a good time being a lawyer. I always knew that at some point in some context, I was sure I wanted to be a judge, because I wanted to be the third one in the family that did. I had no concept specifically of when or how. It was just somewhere in the back of my head. And what happened, again, was a set of fortuitous circumstances that you can't make up, can't happen. It's 1981. I've spent 4 years in the Senate. I'm tired. Everything I wanted to do is done. But Joe McGahn is now going to be running as a Republican to keep me from being reelected. And the selfishness in me, and that's what it was, the selfishness in me said, there is no way that I'm going to walk away from that. I don't really want to do this, but I am not going to walk away from that fight. Because again, I wasn't prepared, and I thought about it in these terms. I wasn't prepared to live the rest of my life explaining to myself, not to mention anybody else, that I had run from McGahn as a coward. So I ran for re-election in what was for me a completely unpleasant experience. By that time, the nature of campaigning had changed and had started to become what it is grotesquely now, which is principally negative. You didn't run for something, you ran against somebody. And I didn't want to do that, but the professionals that I had hired sat down with me in the early summer, and they walked me through what the campaign was going to be like, and what he was going to do, and what I had to do. And it was all about trashing him before and better than he could trash me. And that's what I did. And I hated every minute of it. And I succeeded. But I knew, and this was for a 2-year term. This was in '81 for a 2-year term. And I got selected majority leader of the state Senate. And in Trenton terms, I was in great shape. I had a good relationship with the new governor, Tom Kean, even though he was a Republican and I was a Democrat. We were in the majority, which means I had the ability to make things happen. I was the majority leader, which means I had the ability to make things happen. So I was in good shape in political terms. I had finished the campaign with money left over, and then I had a fundraiser and I raised even more. So I had a campaign chest available to me 2 years before the next election. Everything was great, but I didn't want to be there. And I knew I wasn't going to run again. I didn't tell anybody, with 2 exceptions. I didn't tell anybody I wasn't going to run again. The 2 exceptions were my wife and my best friend. Those are the only 2 people who knew that I wasn't going to run again. So now it's early '83. I've had a good year in '82. We did a whole bunch of things. I worked out deals with the governor's people about how the tax structure was going to be set up. You got to remind me to tell you about the conversation I had with Tom Kean recently about that. It's a great story. Well, I'll tell you right now first. Tom Kean gets in as governor in '82. He has a financial mess on his hands. He's got a Democratic legislature on his hands. He winds up proposing to the legislature a tax program that increases the income tax, the corporate tax, and the sales tax. Okay? And I say to Tom, I've had this conversation with Tom Kean a dozen times over the years, how many bets I have won in the years since then. I say to you, name me the only governor in the history of New Jersey that signed increases in, and they'll come up with any name you want to think of, all of them Democrat. And nobody ever says Tom Kean. You win any kind of bet like that. And Tom's answer to me is, yeah, and he says, I tried to get you to do the gas tax too, but you wouldn't do it. He says, if you'd have done that, I'd have signed that too. In any event, I had worked out through the governor's staff how to get all those bills through the Senate. Just so you know how that works, we had 23 Democrats and 17 Republicans. They needed 21 votes to pass the bills. And I said to the governor's people and to the Republican leader, a good friend of mine also, I said, I've got 6 votes for you. What do you mean? I said, you put up 15, I'll give you 6.
People from safe districts.
You got a lot more than that would vote for this bill. I said, yeah, you're right, I do. But you're only going to get 6. Why am I only going to get 6? Because I want 15 out of your 17 on the bill. You put up 15, I'll give you 6. And yes, the 6 were from safe districts anyway. And I had more than that on their own would have voted for it from a policy point of view, but from a political point of view, we wanted to force the Republicans to take ownership. So that meant they had to put up 15 votes, and they did. I gave them 2 that they could never have gotten, no matter what. And we identified them. And I said to my friend, the Republican leader, I said, you need the other 15. And he got them, and we gave him 6. It's early '83. And I've had a great year as majority leader, but I know I'm not running again. A local judge calls me on the phone. His name is coming up for reappointment in a few months. And he calls me on the phone, he says, can I come see you? I said, no, you can't come see me. I'll come see you. It's just not right. Because in my mind, I elevate a judge higher than a senator. What can I tell you? I think he's coming to me to ask me for help in getting him reappointed. Now, I've known the man for many years. He was a friend of my father's. I'm not going to have any problem at all reappointing him. And that doesn't even get into the business of that I don't believe in senatorial courtesy anyway. Anyway, so I go to his office to see him. And he tells me that he's called me up as a courtesy to tell me that next week he's going to announce his retirement, early retirement. He's moving to Florida. Of course, he doesn't tell me he's moving to Florida with his secretary and leaving his wife here, but that was a different story. But he wants me as a courtesy to know that there's going to be a vacancy. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So literally the next night, I'm out to dinner with my wife and my best friend and his wife, the 4 of us. We go out to dinner a lot. And I tell him the story, and I say, I got 3 or 4 names that I think would be good to replace him. And I give him the names. And he looks at me. I'm going to clean up what he said a little bit. He looks at me and he says, are you out of your mind? What do you mean? He said, what's the matter with you? What are you talking about? Is you going to run again? I said, no. He says, you want to be a judge? I said, yeah. What's the matter with you? Are you ever going to be in a better position to become a judge than you are at this minute? Now, I've thought about that conversation a lot over the years. Would I have thought of it on my own? Maybe. Maybe. Maybe not, but maybe. But I sure as hell hadn't thought of it that night. Oh. So I go home, I talk to my wife, I think about it. A couple of days later, I'm thinking about it, and the more I think about it, the better idea I like it. So for the first time on 3 occasions, I go in to see the governor of New Jersey. It was to happen twice more later in my life. This one happens to be a Republican, as was one of the others. And I shut the door, and I said, Tom, this is May of '83. I said, Tom, there's a vacancy in the Superior Court in Atlantic County, and I want the seat. Now imagine what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a lawyer walking into the governor's office and saying to the governor, I want you to appoint me to the Superior Court. And knowing full well that he's going to say yes. Forget that it was to his political advantage to do so because he was going to pick up a seat in the Senate. Forget that. He and I had that kind of relationship that would have been an easy thing for him to do. Forget the fact that he didn't need to call the Republican county chairman or the Democratic county chairman or any of the other things that other lawyers in real life have to do. How many lawyers do you have ever heard of that walk into a governor's office and say, hey, Tom, I want to be a judge? Okay. And I was to do it again later with Donnie D. The second time. And with Christine Whitman. Okay. I said, there's one problem with this. I said, this is May. I said, I don't want you to say anything to anybody until I'm ready, because I won't be ready until June after we get all the taxes done and everything else, and I got to set up and I got to do this, that, and the other thing. So can we just keep it between us? Okay. He would have said okay to anything because of who we were to each other. So long story short, I get appointed. The world is amazed, except for my wife and my best friend. And now it's July of 1983. Gormley was thrilled. He didn't know anything about it until after the fact, but he was thrilled. I get sworn in by the assignment judge in Atlantic County, Judge Gruccio, who was an old dear friend of my family's. Judge Gruccio had arranged, without telling me, that he put in his courtroom, he had a special courtroom on the first floor that they used for ceremonial events. Without telling me about it, he took the pictures of my father and my grandfather that were upstairs in the courthouse, and he had them brought down and placed behind the bench in the court where I was going to be sworn in. And I had remembered from the day my father was sworn in, which had been in 1966, so it was what, 17 years earlier. I had remembered a quote from the Bible that my father had included in the ceremony where he was sworn in, and I asked Judge Gruccio to use it. It's from Micah. What is required of thee, O Lord, other than to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God? The Lord said, what is required of thee? So Gruccio put that in his remarks. I had the entire family there. I wore the judicial robe. I was given the judicial robe that my father had worn, and that I had worn ever since. And when I put that robe on, the first time, it was to happen again later, years later. When I put that robe on the first time, it was again a surreal moment, because I literally felt embraced and enveloped in the whole family history. And being a judge, I'm very grateful for everything I was given the chance to do. I loved being a legislator. I didn't love being chief of staff, but it was an important job. I think that I did well, and I was very grateful for having had the opportunity. The moment that I was able to find at the Casino Control Commission was a magic moment, because all of the circumstances were right for me to be able to do at that time what I wanted to do and thought needed to be done, and had the support in Trenton to do, and at the commission. So I loved that. But being a judge was the fulfillment of every personal goal I've ever had. And I had the advantage being a judge. I worked with several assignment judges who were, again, very accommodating to whatever I needed and wanted. I wound up, before it got finished, serving in every division in the court, a statement that I believe every judge should be required to do, or at least be interested in doing, but a lot of them aren't. But I served initially in the civil part, then in the family part, then in the criminal part, then back in the civil part. I tried, including a capital case, every kind of case that there is in the system, and I tried them in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different counties. I loved every bit of it. Just trying to think of how to answer you. Let me answer you this way. In the summer of 1990, when I was chief of staff, we had finished the legislative agenda for the year. We had done the taxes and everything else. It was brutal. It was eventually, 3 years later, to cost Governor Florio his reelection. It was an exhausting, brutal experience. The governor called me one day and told me that he wanted me to accept his nomination to be chairman of the Casino Control Commission. And would I please think about it? Told him I would think about it, and he was going to be coming to Margate for some party or something a couple of days later, and I'll stop at your house, fine. So I thought about it for a few days, and he came to the house and we talked about it. And the positives were that I believed that at that moment in time, with the agenda that needed to be done, that I had been working on anyway over the course of the year as Chief of Staff for the Casino Commission, with the agenda that needed to be done, it was the perfect time for me to come in and kickstart what was going on at the Commission and get it modernized and get the statutes updated and do a good job. I knew I could do a good job, or at least I believed I could. The downside of it was, and the good side also was, that I had served for the year as Chief of Staff, and I knew that at that point everything tough that had to be done was done, and the rest of it was political repair, and political repair was never my long suit. Governor wanted to bring in a guy that had worked for him for many years in the political environment, who was very good at that. So from the governor's point of view, the nomination made a whole lot of sense. From my point of view, I had to make a choice about whether I wanted to stay in government at that point. I was financially starting to struggle, but the Casino Commission was attractive. And when the governor asked me why I was doing all of this, why I was staying in government, I told him that it was my ambition, had always been my ambition, that someday, if the circumstances were ever right, I would like to serve on the Supreme Court. And we left it there. I decided to take the commission job, and I never regretted a moment of it. I did it for almost 4 years, by which time I had completed my agenda and run out of money, and I had to go now into the private sector and pay off all my bills, which I did. Governor Florio was defeated for re-election in '93. And on the night of that election, I was watching on television, and as he gave his concession speech, he said something to the effect of, "I feel badly for my family." Well, not for myself. I did everything I wanted to do. He is saying, "I feel badly for my family and my friends and from people who would have had a lot to look forward to in the next administration." And it was just, I thought it was a very gracious kind of thing. So I called him the next day to commiserate, if you will. And he said something like, "Did you hear what I said last night?" I said, "Yeah, I did. I thought it was terrific." He said, "I had you in mind." Now, during the next 4 years, which would have been his second term, there were 2 appointments that were made to the Supreme Court. You can tell me, I can't tell you whether I would have gotten one of them. It's very possible. But I never had a commitment or an understanding or anything like that. He knew I wanted it, at least at that time. Now, as it turned out, it didn't happen because he didn't get reelected. And what did happen was that I used the next several years. I went to work for a gaming company out west, and I made a lot of money, at least by my standards. I paid off all my bills, and then I went back to practice law, and then I went back on the bench the second time in the 2000s because I didn't owe anybody any more money. If I had been appointed to the Supreme Court, I would have been financially in a very different position than I wound up being. So you make it work. I say nobody ever beats an incumbent for any office. The incumbent loses. Okay? Whether it's mayor of Atlantic City or governor of New Jersey or president of the United States or governor, whatever it is, the incumbent loses. Governor Florio lost his re-election in 1993 almost exclusively because of what he had done in 1990 with respect to restructuring the state's finances. That involved an increase in the income tax, an increase in the sales tax, an increase in the corporate tax, a restructuring of a lot of different things. And from a financial structure and financial planning point of view, it was then and it is now perceived by anybody who studies it carefully to be considered as absolutely the necessary thing and the proper thing to do. But as Governor Florio and I have discussed many times over the years, the politics of it were not well handled, by which I mean We started out in January, we finished in June. It was a full court press the entire time. We succeeded in getting the votes in the legislature in both houses. But we solved problems that the people of New Jersey didn't fully understand that we had. And we didn't do, in retrospect, a very good job of campaigning to the electorate, to the general public, about what we were doing and why we had to do it. What I have concluded since then and have advised several candidates for governor about is that it's not enough to go and put out a program and get the legislature to approve it. You've got to deal with it as if you were still running for office. You get elected as governor, you put the program out there, and then you adopt a 90-day, 120-day, pick a number, campaign scenario status. You go out and you meet with whomever there is to meet. You use social media, you do whatever you got to do as if you were running for office to sell your program to the people. We didn't do any of that in 1990. We got it done well and right, and then Florio paid the ultimate price. When she got in, Christine Whitman did exactly what she said she would do. She cut back on the income tax, she cut back on this and that. Governors that succeeded her, including McGreevey and Corzine, and certainly Christie, followed her lead. The policies that she set in 1994, which was her first year, continue to exist today. And the state of New Jersey today is functionally bankrupt, not literally. But the state of New Jersey is billions of dollars in debt with respect to funded obligations that it cannot meet. No one in Trenton and no one locally, this goes back to the discussion we had earlier about county government, no one has come forward and introduced a program that says, you know what? New Jersey is operating at the state and local level with governmental structures that were invented 200 years ago. And they worked very well for 180 years or so. Now they don't work. Now we've got far too much government. Now we've got too many municipalities and too many overlaps. We can't afford it anymore and we don't need it anymore. Now, I'm not saying to do the politically impossible and consolidate municipalities. That would be a great idea. It's not going to happen. But what you could do and should do, and Trenton needs to take the lead on this, and so do counties, is you can say, let's take Atlantic County with 23 municipalities. We don't need 23 tax assessors. We don't need 23 chiefs of police. We don't need 23 municipal court judges. On and on and on. You consolidate them, the services. You bring them in under the umbrella of the county government where you need to. Yes, does that increase the size and therefore the cost of county government? Sure it does. Does it net decrease the cost of government? You bet it does. Because you are eliminating job after job after job in the public sector that you no longer need and can't afford. And Trenton should be initiating some of that with some financial aid packages to the counties. And you wind up with a far smaller profile of government and government cost than you have today. Now, once you're finished with that, then you have to attack the whole vested system of public employees and pensions. I had a conversation, Clifford Goldman was the state treasurer under Byrne and a genius. He died a year or two ago and very sad about that. Had lunch with him one day with Governor Byrne. It was about 2 years ago. I can tell you exactly when it was. It was in May of 17. It was right before the gubernatorial primary in the year 17. And somebody said to Goldman, have you talked to Murphy yet about running? Murphy was a candidate at that time in the primary. And no, I haven't. Well, if you did talk to him, what would you tell him? Now, the questioner meant, what would you tell him about how to restructure? And Goldman says, I'd tell him not to run. And everybody laughed. And then he said, no, I'm serious. He says, He points to somebody across the table who was on a state pension. And he says to him, this is May of 17. Points to him and he says, your pension runs out in 2021. There's no money. He looks at me and he says, your pension runs out in 2022. You got an extra year. Now the state of New Jersey has legal obligations with respect to those pensions. Somebody has a right to sue the state and get paid. I'm not planning to sue, but I'm just making the point. The pensions are underfunded. The healthcare system is underfunded, the Medicaid system at the state level. All manner, look, you drove to get here today. I guarantee you no matter what road you used, it needs work, okay? I'm not even into rebuilding the Lincoln and the Holland Tunnel and the bridges and whatnot, or the train system, any of the North Jersey stuff. The infrastructure needs of New Jersey are drastically underserved. But we're dealing with Christie Whitman's tax plan. I was afraid you would ask that. I did. I had many interactions with him. The first, with Donald Trump, the first interaction was the very best, and it went downhill from there. When I was appointed as chief of staff to the governor, this is fall, right after the gubernatorial election of '89, I get a call from Donald Trump's office. Donald Trump would like to have dinner with you and your wife. Donald Trump and his wife would like to have dinner with you and your wife at Castle, Trump's castle. I thought about it for a while. I figure I owe the obligation. He is who he is. He's an important part of the industry in Atlantic City. He wants to meet me, presumably to sell me on whatever. I certainly have an obligation to listen. I'm not very happy about it, the way he has structured it, because in my mind, the four of us are going to meet for dinner, and then he's going to spend the dinner campaigning with me, and the wives will be left to their own devices. My wife is even less happy than I am about the prospect, but we both acknowledge that we should do it. So we arrange for dinner on a given night, whatever it was. I come home, I pick up my wife, and we drive to the castle. And I had made sure that he understood and his staff understood that he was paying for him and his wife and I was paying for me and mine. That's another story. In any event, we get there and he comes in, introduces, obviously I know who he is, he's alone. Ivana couldn't make it tonight. We find out 4 or 5 days later that that was the day that they broke up, which we didn't know that night, but they're. So now he's in dinner with the two of us, and my wife is even more concerned than before, because he's got a lot to talk to me about, and here she is hanging out there. It was anything but. He was gracious. He kept her involved in most of the conversation. Talked about kids, talked about this, talked about it. He did have some things he wanted me to know that he wanted me to know or ask about. But overall, the evening was very pleasant. And I was pleasantly surprised, and I have those memories of that night, and it was nice. Then I got to the commission. That was in November of '89. I get to the commission a year later. And for the 3.5 years that I was at the commission, I had many occasions to be with him, all of them in my office, with at least somebody else. And occasionally out in the public meetings, but mostly he would ask for a meeting because he wanted to talk to me about something. And usually he would have his CEO with him, and I would have staff with me. Those were universally and uniformly very difficult meetings. Not unpleasant, but difficult. Because keeping his focus where it needed to be and where even he wanted it to be was extremely difficult. So it wound up, for the most part, in those meetings, that I would interact with his chief of staff and he would be sitting there. Because you couldn't get him to stay on message or stay on focus for any length of time or in any detail. Jim Whelan and I had, I guess, a complicated relationship. We started out as running mates. In 1981, I was running for re-election to the Senate. He was running for election to the County Board of Freeholders. We had a good year in the sense that we worked together closely. He didn't win. I was very disappointed. I did. Then 9 years later, I was in the governor's office. He ran for mayor of Atlantic City. And the governor and I were very, very pleased that he got elected. And the governor actually came down to Atlantic City to swear him in. Then I got to the Casino Commission a few months later, and for the rest of my time at the commission, he was mayor, I was at the commission, and we were, by and large, we worked together well. I mean, there were some things that I wanted to do, again, on the line of the city assuming more responsibility for the agenda than they had been willing to achieve. He was somewhat more reluctant than I had hoped that he would have been, but our dialogue was fine. We had there was a fellow at the commission, one of the members of the commission that he was close to, that wound up drifting away from my agenda. So it was a kind of like a three-way parlay. And that complicated my relationship with Jim. But I think he did a good job. Certainly he was an honest man. And then when he got elected to the Senate for the first time, which I think was in 08 or 09, 08 or 09, one or the other. I think it was a special election in 09, I believe. He called me, we had a good conversation. He asked me about the process of appointing judges and reviewing candidates and whatnot. And we had a long conversation about that. And I gave him the benefit of my experience with respect to that. And then after that, we didn't have a lot of contact. He sponsored legislation a couple of years later to restructure the governance of the casino industry, making major changes in the statute. Major changes in the statute didn't offend me because I had made major changes in the statute of my own, as I mentioned, after I got to the commission. But the ones that Jim sponsored were ones I didn't agree with, and I told him that I didn't, and I, in fact, was asked to appear in Trenton to testify, and I did. And he was not happy with me that I appeared there to speak in opposition to his bill. So we had a more distant relationship toward the end than at the beginning. But I think he was an honest man, and I think he did a very good job. Bill Gormley and I ran at the same time for the first time in 1977. He had run 2 years before as a freeholder candidate, and I was not on the ballot. He had been elected. And then in 77, he ran for the Assembly when I ran for the Senate, obviously on different tickets. And we were both elected. And it has never escaped my memory that on the night of the election, when we were having our party at the restaurant right over there, not Knife and Fork, but the one next to it, we were celebrating, and Gormley showed up at 10:30 at night as a Republican, newly elected Republican candidate showing up at the Democratic Party celebrating the election, which I thought was classy. And I told him I thought it was classy, and I told him that we should have lunch, and that was a Tuesday night. We had lunch on Thursday. And I said to him, look, you're going to be a Republican assemblyman, I'm going to be a Democratic senator. I want you to know two things. Number one, I will help you any way I can, and I hope you will help me. And to the extent that we can get past the obvious political difference, we should. And number two, you will never do to me what I just did to McGahn. For as long as I want to be senator, I will be senator. And when I stop wanting to be senator, you can be whatever you want to be. But I want you to understand that I have no concerns, because I will do whatever I have to do to make sure I'm not going to lose an election to you. I said that to him. That started a terrific, we were then in the legislature for 5 years. He ran again in '79 and again in '81 for re-election to the Assembly, and he won both times. I ran in '81 again on his opposite ticket, and I won again. For the 5 years that we served together, it was terrific. We disagreed, obviously, on a whole lot of political stuff, but we could talk to each other and did regularly. We worked together on a great number of pieces of legislation. If he had an idea that he was in the Republican Party, they were in the minority in the Assembly. So he needed Democratic help to get anything done. And he came to me, among others, for the Democratic help. And I was happy to give it to him, where I agreed with him. And among other things, we did a constitutional amendment on riparian rights. I sponsored it, he wrote it. And it was his initiative in the Assembly that got the Republicans to agree to it. We worked together on a lot of things, and it was a politically effective relationship, the kind of relationship you can't have today, and it breaks my heart. He and I were of opposite parties. We worked together wherever we could. We didn't have a particularly personal or social relationship. I mean, we had dinner together a few times, but we never or very rarely went to each other's houses, only for special moments. I mean, he came to my house when my brother died to offer condolences, and I went to his house where there was some reception for somebody, but it wasn't that we were that close personally. We were comfortable with each other personally, we talked to each other, we worked together. The kind of thing that Republicans and Democrats should always do, did do then, don't do now. Today, if I'm a Democrat or if I'm a Republican, my main objective is not to accomplish my agenda. Today, your main agenda, if you're elected, is to make sure the other guy doesn't get what he wants. And that's tragic. And it should be an embarrassment to everybody that's in the system, both parties, and it's certainly a disappointment to the public interest. But Gormley and I never had that. We could do what we had to do with each other, and we could fight when we had to fight. But the fighting was never, he was my adversary, never my enemy. And there's a big difference, big difference. It has to do, I'm trying to remember his name. Rosenblum, that's who it was. I grew up in Margate and went to school with a fellow named Steve Rosenblum, who lived a block and a half away from me. His father's name was Carol Rosenblum, and Carol Rosenblum was the owner of the Baltimore Colts. So, as I grew up, I was a Baltimore Colts fan. And the 1959 NFL championship game that the Colts won in overtime is still, 60 years later, one of the highlights of my professional athletic life. And then Carol Rosenblum sold his interest in the Baltimore Colts. I want to say it was, I'm trying to remember when. I don't remember when.
Early 60s.
I think that's right. And I was very disappointed with respect to that. So I had to find another team to root for. And it certainly wasn't going to be the Philadelphia Eagles.
Oh, God.
And Roger Staubach at that time had gotten out of the Navy and was going to go to be the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. So I figured I'd give that a shot. And my loyalty to professional sports teams is second only to my loyalty to family relationships of any kind, one in particular. So when I go with the team, I stay with the team. And I've been a Dallas fan ever since. Not apologetic about it. I can do it. As a result of circumstances created by others, I did what I wanted to do, when I was given the opportunity to do it, in the way that I wanted to do it, with the results that I wanted to achieve. And while there are obviously a few things I would have done differently, not many, and not serious. Burt Lancaster.
Atlantic City.
That was the most Atlantic, in my opinion, the most Atlantic City identity of the three. I love that movie. When they walked on that boardwalk, I was like, hello! I could identify the blocks that they were walking on. It was... Oh my goodness, I was hoping somebody would ask me. I was a candidate for the Assembly in 1971 when Governor Cahill in the summer showed up at a place somewhere, I think they call it Galloway Township or someplace like that, and they broke the ground for Stockton College, and I was there that afternoon. Then when I got elected the next year, I was invited to teach and did teach at the hotel on the boardwalk, and now I'm blocking on the name.
Mayflower.
The Mayflower Hotel on the boardwalk. I then later on was invited to teach at classes at Stockton. I have watched every building. I mean, the building that I saw the ground broken on and they cut the ribbon on in the next year was this building, and now you can't even see it in terms of the world of Stockton College, not to mention that here we are in Atlantic City at Stockton College. Excuse me, Stockton University. It was then Richard Stockton State College, now it is Stockton University. So what that does is explain the color of my hair. I was at the very beginning, and I watched it, and I've gloried and thrilled with what has happened, because to me it is a symbol of the growth, in every sense of the word growth, of this community. And I'll close with just one quick one. In March of 1974, my wife gave birth to twins. The next day I got a letter in the mail from the president of Stockton College, Richard Bjork, admitting my sons to the Stockton College class of 1996. And I wrote him back, and on behalf of my sons, I accepted the admission with the understanding that the tuition in 1996 would be the same as it was in 1974. And Dick Bjork and I enjoyed that story for the rest of his life. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you. This was terrific. This was terrific.